And you should have just been notified about the recording. We've chosen the Zoom webinar platform for this meeting to ensure security and minimize the chance of technical issues. I'll acknowledge it has some limitations, and in a few minutes we'll talk to you about the logistics and how participation works on this platform. In addition, I do want to let everyone know that we have Spanish language translation services available tonight. So let's go to the next slide. And the way this works, we're providing Spanish language translation services, and regardless of whether you're taking advantage of the translation or not, we do ask that you select a language. And so you can see on the graphic here at the bottom of your screen, you should see a little globe where you can make a selection to participate in English or in Spanish. And the Spanish translation recording will be posted to our website along with the English translation, the English version. We ask that people speak slowly tonight for the benefit of our translators. If you would like a version of the slides or today's presentation translated into another language, you can email us at guidelines@mass.gov. You can feel free to provide your oral and written comments in your preferred language, and we'll ensure translation occurs after the fact. So with that, I would like to introduce Martha, one of our translators from Fox Translation Services, to provide information about how you can request the Spanish language translation tonight.
Buenas noches y bienvenidos. Estamos proporcionando servicios de interpretación hoy en la noche durante esta sesión. Entonces, todos los participantes pueden seleccionar una canal de idioma. Se encuentra un globo al fondo de la pantalla y puede seleccionar español. También estamos grabando la sesión de hoy en la noche y vamos a compartir la grabación de la versión en español en nuestro sitio web de los bosques como soluciones climáticas. Les rogamos que hablen lentamente para los intérpretes. Y si usted quisiera pedir una versión de la presentación de hoy en otro idioma, por favor envíe un correo electrónico a guidelines@mass.gov. Y puede proporcionar sus comentarios en cualquier idioma y vamos a traducirlos para que sean accesibles para todos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Martha. And if you're having any trouble with either setting your language or any questions about translation, you can use the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to assist you. Okay, so with that, I want to give a little bit of an introduction. And first, I want to say that we had over 250 people register for this meeting, which is really amazing. We're so grateful. We have about over 180 who are on right now. And it just speaks volumes about the importance of forests, how deeply we all care about them, and how committed we are as a Commonwealth and a community to fighting climate change. So climate change is the defining issue and challenge of our time. Governor Healy has taken an aggressive, nation-leading, whole-of-government approach to tackling climate change, not the least of which is creating our Office of Climate Investment and Resilience. So across state government, we are asking hard questions about what are the most prudent actions that we can take now, that we need to take now to meet the challenges and impacts of what we're already experiencing because of climate change. So given of what we're facing and really what we're experiencing, it's so critical that we're consulting the latest science to inform our policy choices and our actions. Of course, this includes forests, which, as you know, provide critical carbon drawdown and storage, as well as resilient from the more frequent and intense storms we are already seeing, and we've just seen in the last 24 hours, tremendous impacts in places like Leominster and Springfield and North Attleboro. So the Forests Climate Solutions Initiative was announced in June. It's bringing a new focus, a new and elevated focus on forests and climates. And we're ensuring that our decisions are informed by the best climate science, that we're using all the tools in the toolbox to keep our forests vital, to keep our forests as forests for the long term. We know that forests offer many benefits to people and the environment. And similarly, our administration has heard many different views about forests, and we've convened this process to better understand our current approaches, confirm that we're following the latest science and the best practices. And it's really important to us that we hear all perspectives, and that's what this meeting is really about. So we value your input, and we really appreciate that you've made the time to be with us this evening. So next, I'm going to introduce the panelists. So let me start. I'll go top to bottom on my screen. Caroline Higley is here. She's our Assistant Secretary for Strategic Initiatives and Agency Coordination with the EEA. I'll actually go a little bit out of order here. Kurt Gärtner is our Assistant Secretary for Environmental Policy. We also have with us Susan Podsiba, who is not part of the EEA team. She's a consultant and facilitator from Podsiba Policy Mediation. And you had a chance to meet Martha, one of our translators, and Katya is the other one. I do want to acknowledge that our climate chief, Melissa Hopper, was planning to tune into this meeting while on the road for another engagement this evening. And so we're so pleased to have her leadership. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is to seek your input, your ideas, your perspectives relative to climate-oriented management guidelines that the state is developing as part of the Forests Climate Solutions Initiative. We have convened a climate forestry committee of experts who are advising the state on this effort. Some members of that committee are here with us listening in tonight, and I want to thank them for their time and their attention in being here tonight. So next, I want to turn to the agenda. We've already checked off a couple of things. We've talked about translation services. I'm giving you here the introduction. And next, we'll give you some brief background about the Forests Climate Solutions Initiative. And then we will explain how the public input session is going to work, talk about the logistics and how this platform works, review the framing questions, and then really just get right into the public input. I do want to note, I said this already, we're in listening mode tonight by design. We are going to carefully review comments that are shared at this meeting, written comments that we receive as well. The Climate Forestry Committee will receive that material, and we will all consider the input to inform development of these climate-oriented guidelines. You may be able to see in the chat, or I will tell you directly, that we have a lot of people signed up to speak tonight. I think we have something like 50. So think ahead about your comments. We want to hear from everybody, but ask that you really try to really stick with the 3-minute time limit or use less time if possible, just so that out of respect for everyone, so we can hear from everyone and hear every voice this evening. So as I said, in a minute, you're going to hear more about sort of logistics so you can feel comfortable with the platform and understand how to participate. But before we do that, I'm going to turn it over to Assistant Secretary Gärtner, who's going to give you a brief overview of the Forests Climate Solutions Initiative.
Good evening, everyone. We want to begin with a little bit about perspective, motivation, if you will. And of course, as Undersecretary Cooper has mentioned, a primary goal here is to protect and manage our forests in a way that achieves resilience rather to projected disturbances from climate change, the kinds of more frequent and intense storms we have seen over the last several days. And I think this is a principal motivation for the Commonwealth, and I know many of you are very concerned about this, ensure both stable carbon sequestration, continuing drawdown of carbon from the atmosphere, as well as storage of carbon in trees for the long term as part of our climate change mitigation efforts. As we're going to mention a fair amount this evening, we are striving to understand the latest thinking, latest science around carbon sequestration, climate change mitigation. That is a motivation for this Forests Climate Solutions Initiative in the first place. It is a determinant of our decision making. How we manage state lands, one that we will work to balance with other important priorities, such as habitat preservation, biodiversity, and water quality, each of which I think we also want to acknowledge is in turn affected by climate change, which we are already experiencing. So strategic application of the climate-oriented guidelines you are all here to provide input, comment on this evening will be very important. We understand that this is a complex, diverse, dynamic environment in which we're working, the nature of our forests and their conditions do call for, rather than a single set of policies or actions, we need something that we can apply in a way that recognizes the biodiversity, the procedures and standards need to reflect the priorities we're placing on climate, but we need to incorporate them in a way into our operating standards, our management plans and the like, and advance them in a way that reflects the importance, but also offers some flexibility. As has come up, EEA has convened a climate forestry committee to seek expert advice and opinion on latest climate science, the ways in which we can address carbon sequestration and storage. We think these are important voices that will be offering us recommendations. We are also, however, much as we are this evening, listening to lots of other voices in this space. We want to hear from you this evening. We've already received a number of written comments as well, including other data and science folks would like us to consider. But we are looking to the Climate Forestry Committee to ensure that they are bringing to our attention the latest climate science and offering us advice as to how we can approach land management for the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife and the Department of Conservation and Recreation, both state parks and water supply lands. And this is important. We are going to talk about this a bit this evening. We are focusing on management on state lands, but lands owned by others are also important to the overall health of the Commonwealth, to achieving our climate goals. And we're going to look at incentive programs based on these guidelines for those landowners as well. Context. Why is this so important to the Commonwealth? Why have we launched Forest as Climate Solutions? Why are there so many folks joining us this evening? Well, because the Commonwealth is, of course, heavily forested. About 3 million acres, 57% of the Commonwealth in forest land cover. Of those acres, about 2 million owned by an entity other than government, so about 1.9 million acres. Public ownership, about 1 million acres, of which 525,000 acres are owned by the Commonwealth, either through the Division of Conservation and Recreation. You can see the acres held by both the Division of State Parks and the Division of Water Supply Protection. Also, the Department of Fish and Game's Division of Fisheries and Wildlife holds about 143,000 acres. To give you a sense of state ownership and all of the land that is owned by the Commonwealth and that would be principally subject to the management guidelines you're here to provide input on this evening. Also, important context to this conversation. In recent years, the Commonwealth has harvested on average about 1,450 acres. Under 1% of state land holdings have forest management conducted in an individual year. So we are here this evening to talk principally about the first major component of Forest as Climate Solutions branch, if you will. That is the issuance of climate-oriented forest management guidelines. However, this is but one of a number of important initiatives that are part of our work and the Healey-Driscoll administration's approach to addressing forests in the context of climate change. So as part of this first branch to ensure future land use management decisions fully account for climate mitigation, we are in the process of developing new climate-oriented management guidelines. Those will be used for all state forest management projects. We have paused active forest management for 6 months, a pause that will end in December with the resumption of forest project review, with those new guidelines in place, allowing a reasonable but fixed period for guideline development so that we can resume important work among our 3 divisions. The second very important aspect of Forest as Climate Solutions we want to provide as context this evening is land conservation and expansion of forest reserves. The reduction of conversion. The more forests that we stay in a forested state that are not converted to a developed use is important to us and the objectives in this space. We have a number of initiatives that are attempting to reduce the conversion. Another thing that will very much help us with keeping forests in a forested state is land conservation. The more land we can permanently protect, preclude conversion to another use, the more we are benefiting our Forest as Climate Solutions Initiative and our climate goals and greenhouse gas mitigation efforts. Another important aspect of this is expansion of forest reserves. This goes back to a commitment of Governor Healy during her campaign, and that is to pursue a new focus on and investment in public and private forest reserves. The guidelines that we are going to talk about this evening and the whole initiative takes place in the context of a focus on reserves, expansion of reserve areas on public and private lands, and something that will be worked on over the course of the coming months and years as we work to implement Forest as Climate Solutions. The third branch is offering incentives to forest landowners, businesses, and rural communities. As was mentioned a minute ago, much of the forested land in the Commonwealth is owned by an entity other than the Commonwealth. We also know how important it is that those lands be managed in a way that helps us with our climate goals, and we intend, as part of the initiative, to offer other landowners incentives to pursue climate-oriented forestry techniques and forest management. And we want to help those who are doing forestry improve their business practices, ensure that they are environmentally friendly and carbon sensitive as they pursue businesses, and also, importantly, that as much of the wood as harvested as possible is provided and utilized in the form of durable wood products, keeping the carbon that is harvested in a conserved state for as long as possible. And finally, the fourth major branch of the initiative, data. We do very much want to be more transparent about data, the guideline developments, and that process is about the latest climate science, but that is not where that stops. That becomes and continues to be an important part of the management done by the state agencies, by the talented individuals within our 3 divisions. And we want to be sure that we are being systematic, transparent about the data we're incorporating, the management we're performing, and the results we're achieving. The management that we are doing, the existing climate smart forestry approach, we want to look at that, enhance that, provide data that informs it, and based on the input of our climate forestry committee and all of you, improve our practices. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Assistant Secretary Higley to talk a bit about logistics as we move into the input session of this evening.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. So as previously mentioned, we are using the Zoom webinar platform, which is very necessary to keep the session safe for everyone. There are, however, 2 notable limitations to Zoom webinar technology that are outside of our control. The first, unfortunately, attendees cannot see each other, but to address that, we can share the attendee list after this session ends, and you should be able to see attendee count in live time. And second, the webinar function does not allow for video permissions for those providing oral comment. The second logistical note I'll mention is that we kindly request that you use the question and answer Q&A function at the bottom of the screen for logistical or clarifying questions, which we will do our best to address on a running basis, both in live time and written, depending on the circumstances. I believe we have addressed all of them so far, or will shortly address them through this logistics portion. And if you wish to comment otherwise, please do sign up for oral comment and use the written comment portal that we've created as well. So for the oral comments, if an attendee wishes to speak, please sign up via the form that was distributed on the webpage and event notice and was also provided in the Zoom registration confirmation email. I'll post that link in the chat momentarily in the order of sign up through about 5:45 p.m. If you don't see your name towards the end, that's okay. I'm going to refresh that about halfway through the session and make sure that we keep that live. When it is time for you to speak, the facilitator, Susan, will read your name aloud. I will give you speaking permissions and you may begin. Speaking time is limited to 3 minutes, which will be visible via the on-screen timer that we have. And again, as Undersecretary mentioned, we have a lot of folks signed up, so we kindly request that you're respectful of time. And as needed, Susan will call attention to that time as well. That's what the timer looks like. And finally, as a reminder for oral comments, please speak slowly and enunciate so our translators can keep up with us. And then a few comments, just so folks are aware before oral comments are kicked off. Written comments can be shared via the form on our webpage. Submission of written comments related to this session by Friday, September 15th at 5 p.m. will facilitate consideration. Other than that, draft guidelines, wanted to note that draft guidelines will be available for review and comment prior to the next input session. If you'd like to sign up for email updates, we've created a form on our website to opt in. And then if you have any additional comments or questions not related to this specific public listening session or wish to share any attachments or whatnot, you can email them to guidelines@mass.gov. And with that, before we skip to the framing questions, I'm going to post the list of oral commenters into the chat right now, along with that link, so folks have an understanding of where they are in the queue.
Answering a question that's been posed in the Q&A, the slides that were utilized will be made available.
Sorry, I'm going to try that one more time on this link. All right. That has since been shared with everyone, and I believe that we can go to the framing questions, Kurt. So to facilitate the session, we have developed 3 framing questions for your review, and we kindly request that in order to guide the session overall. And in the oral comment sign up, we requested that folks indicate which framing questions they wish to speak to. And if you do have targeted answers, we request that you call attention to that in your oral comment if you wish. As a reminder, these framing questions, I'll read through them in a second. They will be kept up on screen as we go to help facilitate the conversation. Number 1, what role should humans play in optimizing carbon storage and sequestration in forests to advance other objectives such as clean water, habitat for rare species, or wood products? Number 2, what is your definition or concept of forest reserves? What, if any, is the role of human intervention in maintaining reserve conditions? Number 3, according to the Massachusetts Climate Change Assessment from 2022, degraded forest health is expected due to warming temperatures, changing precipitation, increasing pest occurrence, and more frequent and intense storms. What type of forest vulnerability do you think require effort to preserve, protect, fortify, and/or enhance our state forest lands? What management practices or approaches do you suggest to make the forests of Massachusetts more resilient to the conditions projected by the climate change assessment? And with that, I believe that we are ready to begin oral comment. Undersecretary Cooper, do you have any final comments?
I think you covered it all. I was just looking at the Q&A box to make sure. And, Assistant Secretary Higley, as you said, we are, for written comments, we're requesting or we're reviewing everything that comes in by this Friday, September 15th. It's sort of an initial review, but do want to emphasize that we will be accepting comments and input on an ongoing basis as well. So yes, I think we're good to proceed. And I know we have a lot of people signed up, so let's get started.
Okay, thank you. As has been said, each speaker will get 3 minutes, up to 3 minutes to speak. We've got many people signed up and expect many more to sign up as we get started. So, so that we can hear all the comments, and out of respect to all the members of the public, we too ask you to keep to the three minutes. The first name on the list is Don Ogden.
Don, I see your name here 3 times, so I'm going to try each of the 3 times. Hopefully one of them is the live version. You have speaking permissions on one of them, and I believe you need to unmute to offer your comment.
Very good. Thank you. My name is Don Ogden. I'm the co-host of the Enviro Show. Oh, can you hear me? Oh, that's the translation. So I assume I'm speaking to the third, and I want to ask: is the Healy administration really seeking input forest management guidelines, Given the sorry history of the Department of Conservation and Recreation and Mass Wildlife, even adhering to their existing guidelines, shouldn't we be seeking to inform forest management regulations? Shouldn't we have a balanced scientific panel of experts to consider regulations? The above-mentioned rogue agencies need serious oversight with regard to the treatment of our public lands. In the worsening climate crisis, our public lands are being extensively logged, thereby emitting all the stored carbon in the trees, understory, and the disturbed soils into the atmosphere, adding to the overabundance of CO2. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here. And I hope you'll consider my points.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Glenn Ayers.
May I just interrupt for a moment before Glenn speaks? So Martha, we are hearing your translation live, even after having selected English. So I just want to make sure that it's set properly so people are able to hear what they expect. Okay. We are no longer, those who have selected English, I am no longer hearing you. So I think we've corrected that. So I'll go on mute and then we'll, Susan, I'll let you resume.
Okay, thank you. Next speaker is Glenn Ayers.
Thank you very much. My name is Glenn Ayers. I live in Greenfield, Mass. And I appreciate this opportunity to give you some input. And the first thing I will say is I'll follow up on what was just said, in that this discussion about guidelines is sort of like polishing an apple to make it nice and shiny when the apple is actually rotten to the core. And what I mean by that is that the state logging program run by DCR is rotten to the core. And it is a fraudulent enterprise. And I can show you the evidence to prove that. But basically, I only have 3 minutes. So I'll tell you that there's a complete lack of meaningful public input in the process. There's a complete failure by the agencies to follow existing regulations, 302 CMR 16 and 302 CMR 11. And I can prove that to you. The agencies they exploit the MEPA loophole that allows them to conduct logging without any climate impact or really any serious environmental impact. They only have to produce a forest cutting plan or similar generally accepted something according to the loophole. And that forest cutting plan is written by DCR, and then they submit it to DCR for approval. And then the regulations, the 302 CMR 16 regulations, allow DCR, because they consider themselves to be the applicant owner, they get to appeal their own decision to themselves if they don't like the decision that they made on the plan that they wrote and submitted to themselves. And that is completely illegitimate. That's the process that we use now. It is corrupt. There is no other word to use for that. There is no appealable decision that is ever made by an agency. There is no appeal process available to the public. The entire process is arbitrary and capricious. And there is no oversight or accountability. DCR is not subject to anything because they never submit their logging plans to the Stewardship Council for approval. They never issue a decision. The whole thing is completely corrupt. And the fact that we're here tonight talking about guidelines, which are completely voluntary, guidelines are suggestions, it's an outrage. And I'm sorry, but this is a farce as far as I'm concerned. We need to take this seriously. But thank you for the opportunity to provide comments.
Thank you for your comments. The next speaker is Zach Porter.
Thanks. Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Great. I really appreciate the opportunity. My name is Zach Porter. I'm the executive director of Standing Trees. Standing Trees is a nonprofit organization that works to protect public lands across the 6 New England states. I'm based in Montpelier, Vermont, but I am a born and raised Bostonian, grew up just a few blocks from Fenway Park, and know our state lands in Massachusetts very well and care about them deeply. So I'll take your questions here one at a time. Number one, what role should humans play in optimizing carbon storage and sequestration, protecting clean water, habitat for rare species? I want to be clear and emphasize the point that was made earlier. Massachusetts state lands are just 1% of the landscape in Massachusetts. It is a very small portion of the Massachusetts landscape that we're talking about here. And they have an outsized role to play, the same role that the state of New York, which being, again, born a few blocks from Fenway, I don't usually like praising things in New York State, but I will say that New York has us beat and has had us beat for a century and a quarter now on state land management. New York has leveraged its state lands to produce clean water, to protect habitat for rare species, to protect against the floods that are coming our way, just like the one that was mentioned earlier happened yesterday in Leominster and other areas. Those state lands in New York should be a guiding light, an example for what we should be doing with state lands in Massachusetts. And there's plenty of science in the last decade alone that points to that fact. What is my definition or concept of forest reserves? Well, I'll say it would be a radical departure from what a reserve is defined as, to do anything other than to leave reserves alone to allow them to function according to natural processes. That is what a forest reserve is by definition. And number 3 here, this is I think a really interesting question, because forest health is not degraded necessarily by the warming temperatures and other things coming our way from climate change. In fact, there's a lot of science showing that climate change may in fact benefit forests in New England by increasing the heterogeneity that we're looking for, the structural complexity that we're looking for in forests today. And I would argue, and I hope that you all will consider the fact that if we're looking at forests from a real forest health perspective, climate change is not a threat. It may be a threat to harvesting trees that may die from natural causes, but death from natural causes are exactly what our forests need for their own forest health. So there's much more to be said here. I'm running out of time, but I'll thank you again and look forward to visiting with you more.
Thank you very much for answering all the questions and keeping to the time. Much appreciated. Our next speaker is Sarah Freeman.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. I'll be brief. I know there are a lot of people signed up who know a whole lot more about this than I do. My question is, we know there are differing viewpoints regarding forest management, including on the committee. So throughout this process, and especially at the end, how will you make decisions when there are conflicting views? I hope it won't simply be a popularity contest based on the composition of the panel. These are serious issues, and the guidelines deserve to be evaluated on their merits. And I would say, on a personal note, if in doubt, I hope you will lean towards leaving trees standing, because once they're gone, they're gone. And if new thinking evolves, it'll be too late. And last comment, when I consulted our neighborhood group whether to sign on to documents over this issue, they were shocked to even know that there is public lands logging. I live in the Boston area, and I know we're not as impacted, but it was very interesting to hear that reaction. And I think I can leave it at that. Thank you and good luck in making wise decisions.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Carl DeZiora. I apologize if I mispronounced your name.
No one ever gets it right, don't worry. Carl Jura, Conway, Massachusetts. As to the role humans should play, the state should follow the scientific consensus that unmanaged forests accumulate the most carbon and stop logging state-owned forests. As we reach the 1.5-degree climate change tipping point threatening the survival of humans and species worldwide, Massachusetts must reduce its atmospheric carbon contribution. Suggested trade-offs to increase the number of state-listed species are questionable. Most, if not all, remain rated as low conservation priority nationwide. The pre-colonial presence of larger numbers of many listed species is disputed by independent scientists. Expending tax dollars to log forests and release carbon is an unnecessary addition to climate change. Regarding clean water availability, Drs. Foster and Orwig of Harvard Forest point out that from a biochemical, ecosystem function, and water quality perspective, there is strong evidence that a no management policy is prudent. Because development causes the greatest loss of forest cover en masse, the state should enhance Chapter 61 incentives enough to attract more private landowners in the program to provide a source for local wood products. As to the definition of forest reserves, the Wildlands of New England report urges that at least 10% of the region should be set aside as wildlands, an amount about equal to our state-owned forest land. Therefore, our state-owned forest should be defined by state law as wildlands in perpetuity. Doing so will protect biodiversity while providing for quiet enjoyment through low-impact activities. Forest health and climate change. Question number 3. Forests will adapt to climate change-induced warming with the expected northern shift of species. DCR states in its Massachusetts State Forest Action Plan, it is unclear exactly how climate change will influence forested environments. Given this uncertainty, we should follow the advice in Woodlands in New England. A first rule for all managers is to pause to consider the benefits of passive management as an alternative to active management, even in the face of novel processes like invasive organisms and unprecedented environmental change. After all, the past 5 centuries of New England history have witnessed a continuous series of novel physical, chemical, and climatic stresses and disturbances to the region's ecosystems. The forests we now have were shaped by these 5 centuries of novel stresses and primarily degraded by human activity, including logging. We should expect nature can govern our state-owned forest land in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And next speaker is Samuel Gladstone.
I don't see Samuel's name right now.
Okay.
We have one phone listener, and it's possible that if anyone else joins by phone, they may wish to comment as well. We can, if anyone wants to send an email to guidelines@mass.gov, if they are a phone listener that wishes to provide oral comment later on, please do so. I think in the meantime, we can table Samuel Gladstone until later on in case Samuel shows up.
Okay. Sure. Next person then is Lynn Mann.
Thank you for the opportunity to comment tonight. My name is Lynn Mann, and I am a co-leader of the Forest Protection Team of the Massachusetts Sierra Club and RF3 of Climate Action Now Western Mass. I really appreciate that EEA is focusing on the role of forests as integral in addressing our climate and biodiversity crises. You have clearly expressed your understanding of the importance of expanding reserves with minimal to no human interference as critical in meeting climate goals. On this point, we are in complete agreement. I am frustrated, however, by the persistent inclusion of an economic extractive model when talking about utilizing public forests as climate solutions. This model appears in every similar endeavor by EEA, DCR, or DFW. The use of an economic model for how to harvest wood sustainably for forest products is worthwhile from a production perspective, but should not be conflated with actually using forests as a primary tool to address the climate and biodiversity crises. These are two separate issues. It is disingenuous to the public to pretend that logging is somehow good for climate and biodiversity. Similarly, the science behind logging for forest health is questionable at best, and there is increasing evidence that minimal to no human intervention maximizes forest health and ecosystem benefits. The greatest threats to forests today are not warming temperatures, changing precipitation, etc., but large-scale logging using heavy equipment. By putting all public land into reserves, we have the opportunity to preserve large tracts of land and contiguous corridors immediately to maximize carbon sequestration and storage and biodiversity. Two quick comments about the process of developing this initiative. First is the composition of the advisory team that is heavily weighted on the side of those who favor active forest management. While there are several scientists on the panel who support the protection of wildlands, they are greatly outnumbered by those who promote logging for various reasons. This bias is eroding public trust in the outcome. Second, the process lacks transparency. I appreciate the opportunity to provide comments tonight, but there is no discussion in this format, and it is a mystery as to what subsequently becomes of the public's input. Also, the advisory committee meetings are private. While not compelled by public meeting laws, at a minimum, these meetings should be recorded and made available to the public, or even better, live streamed. This would be an important step in fulfilling the mandate for public engagement and would go a long way towards improving the public's trust in the process. Thank you for your time tonight, and I hope that somehow our collective participation today is meaningful.
Thank you. Next speaker is Kavita Karagadam.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Kavita Karigatam, and I thank you all for giving this opportunity for me to talk today. I'd like to endorse all the amazing comments made by the speakers before me, and I know there are a lot of them after me. But I'd like to thank Undersecretary Cooper for meeting with us to discuss an issue we were facing at the NEMT school project that took down 14 acres of our forest just 2 days ago. You might recall the booklet that I shared with you all with the amazing, incredible biodiversity that we have documented at that forest. So when I saw this question, what role should humans play in optimizing carbon storage and sequestration in forests, I just thought the word humans, that means you've included the fact that there are other species on this planet and they need a place to live. The forests are places, homes, habitats for biodiversity, for wildlife, other species than human beings. As it is, we have decimated forested lands, natural spaces in urban areas. And so they have really no place left to move to, and you have migratory populations, we have native species, and of course they get endangered because of habitat loss. And so while studying the NEMT forest and trying to, there are many people who love this forest. And when we documented, we learned so much about this that we decided to write, my children and I. So we wrote that everything is connected, from the canopy of the trees to the moss-covered rock outcrops and the deep underground communicating network of roots, mycorrhizal fungi, and the organisms living in the soil. The topsoil is formed by the slow weathering of the rocks and the accumulation of organic matter from plants and animals over time. This process can take tens of thousands of years to create the nutrient-rich layer of soil that supports plant growth and biodiversity. Habitat diversity is deeply connected with biodiversity of plants, animals, fungi, and soil microorganisms. The current state of life on Earth is a result of a long and gradual process of evolution and adaptation that has taken place over millions of years. There is no understanding of this fundamental knowledge in the schools such as the NEMT, which has, in conjunction with MSBA, brought down this process of evolution in just 2 days by felling and culling trees. Please stop this now, and please protect forests that are left. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Christopher Borgatti.
Hello, my name is Christopher Borgatti. I am the Northeast Coordinator for Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, and I'm a resident of Newbury, Massachusetts. Carbon sequestration as a function of forest is important. However, optimization of carbon sequestration should not drive forest management or the establishment of forest reserves in Massachusetts at the expense of other critical ecosystem services. Instead, it should be integrated into a broader set of objectives. First and foremost, the Commonwealth should work to maintain and expand healthy forest ecosystems across the state and create robust programs that incentivize private landowners to maintain healthy forests. It's private lands that are under the greatest threat of deforestation. The state's forest management goals for public lands should prioritize objectives that are less achievable on privately owned forest land. These state-owned forest objectives should include providing habitat for rare species, promoting diversification in tree species and age classes, managing invasive species, and safeguarding clean water sources. While carbon sequestration is important, building resilient forests capable of withstanding the increasing impacts of a changing climate is paramount. A single drought, fire, storm, or pest outbreak can potentially undo long-term carbon sequestration efforts. Therefore, prioritizing forest health and resilience is crucial for protecting of public forests and their long-term carbon sequestration capabilities. Lest we forget biodiversity. While climate change cannot be halted or slowed solely through state lands, our wildlands can serve as the front line in protecting rare and endangered species and threatened ecosystems. Agencies like Mass Wildlife have already achieved victories in this regard. By grounding our work in the state's wildlands and collaborating strategically with private landowners, we can positively impact the richness and diversity of Massachusetts species. In closing, if the establishment of forest reserves are believed to be a necessary component of the Commonwealth's natural landscapes, then the concept must be flexible and inclusive. It has to be understood that within any given forest, there is a multitude of abiotic and biotic components that need to be kept in reserve. It's not just carbon. Additionally, human intervention guided by the best available science may be necessary at times to ensure the long-term health of the forest. As renowned conservationist Jim Posewitz wisely stated, we do these things for the generations within the womb of time. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you. Next speaker is Lenore Brick.
I believe that Lenore requested a little bit of extra time. Lenore, are you ready to speak now, or would you like to be moved further down the list? May take that as the sign that we should.
I'm having a little bit of tech trouble, but I would like to talk soon. I'm resolving it now.
Okay, we could shift you a little bit further down the list, perhaps.
Please do. Thank you.
Okay, will do. Next speaker then is Charlie Carey.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great, great. I want to just focus attention a little bit on the downstream from the no cut decision, and question what happens to wood after it's cut. Remembering that Massachusetts was pretty much clear cut in the 1850s, so that the forests we have today are really, for the most part, new growth, and a lot of science is saying that our forest is full of carbon at the moment, and if we really want to regenerate the carbon cycle, we need to do some forest management to thin the forest so that we get new growth coming in. And the question is, when a tree is cut, what happens to the wood residue? At the moment, there's an awful lot of wood residue generated by municipalities and arborists and the forest products industries and utilities that is cut and chipped and put on trucks to go down the road to some market. And once it's chipped, its carbon goes back to the atmosphere. The Palmer plant, which I personally did not support because it was a concentration of emissions and an inefficient use of the wood resource, was the developers said they could bring 1,200 tons a day into that plant without cutting down a single tree. And the question, and fortunately that was turned down, but the question is, what is the highest and best use for that resource? And I hope that in developing the strategy for forests, in forest management, we talk a little bit about what is that highest and best use. Because right now, the cost of disposing of wood is higher than the cost of getting it out. It literally is a waste. You know, the Palmer plant was going to pay about $40 a ton. It costs a lot more than that to get the wood to the plant. And from my perspective, if you want private landowners to hold on to their land, it really is essential that you create markets for them to be able to get value from those forests. And certainly creating insulation out of wood residue makes an awful lot of sense, but it requires attracting an awful lot of capital. And there's a lot of uses that people banter about as far as using wood residue. But to drive the market on a local basis, I see wood heating schools and hospitals. At $3 a gallon, a ton of wood is worth $180. It'll generate $180 worth of heat. And I just hope people look at what's happening to the carbon, which is not fossil carbon. The carbon from wood has been in the atmosphere. It's not carbon. It's not fossil carbon. And by heating with wood, you keep fossil carbon in the ground.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Our next speaker is Michael Kellett.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. I'm Michael Kellett. I'm Executive Director of Restore the North Woods. We're a New England nonprofit organization based in Massachusetts. I want to answer those framing questions. Number one, what role should humans play in optimizing carbon storage? It should also involve biodiversity and other public values. And the role we can play is to expand the amount of public lands protected permanently from human intervention, logging, and other intensive management. That provides clean water, habitat for rare species. Wood products is not beneficial in terms of optimizing carbon storage. In fact, it increases the release of carbon into the atmosphere. So that's not a strategy we should be considering. The best way in Massachusetts right now we can do this is to support two bills that are in the legislature right now, HD 4430, an act relative to forest protection, and H 904, an act relative to increased protection of wildlife management areas. These two bills would protect almost 9% of the Massachusetts land base as reserves. And right now, only about 1% of Massachusetts is permanently protected as reserves. The UN has urged that we protect about 30% of the earth as the equivalent of reserves. So Massachusetts is way behind. And by passing these two bills, we would get a big jump on at least approaching that number. In terms of the concept of reserves, the concepts that DCR has right now in general is pretty good in that it doesn't allow commercial logging, and human intervention would be only for unusual situations like endangered species habitats, which are not likely to be a problem, and human health and welfare and so forth. So that definition is pretty good, and those two bills reflect that definition. In terms of addressing climate change through management, the whole thing with assisted migration, with so-called increasing resilience through logging. There's no long-term scientific evidence that logging improves climate resilience or has any benefits in terms of climate change. It's a big experiment. And the best thing we can do is leave the forests alone wherever possible, because they've survived for millennia without human intervention. And that's the likely best option. So thanks again for the opportunity to comment, and I will leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Jillian Davies.
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry, I apologize. I just accidentally gave and removed permission in the same breath. There we go.
Hi, I'm Jillian Davies, and I'm an ecologist, wetland scientist, and soil scientist. And thank you for the opportunity to speak. And with regard to our role, I think our role is to really grapple with the best available science and have the science guide our policies. And as a wetland scientist, one of the most difficult things is mapping of forested wetlands at the higher scale, like from aerial photos or LiDAR or whatever. And so in forest management, one thing that could be considered, hopefully would be considered, is to involve wetland scientists to identify where wetland forests or forested wetlands are located, and to do full carbon accounting for those areas, because we know that wetlands store a disproportionate amount of carbon in the soil. So if you are, for instance, impacting a wetland forest, the carbon impacts are going to be greater than an upland forest. And I just wonder if forest discussions are really thinking that through. And then the other thing that I sometimes don't see in a lot of the forest documents is discussion of how critical the next few decades are. It's almost make or break what we do in between now and 2030 and now and 2050. And factoring that in, we may have different strategies. We may need kind of emergency strategies for these next few decades to see, where we are in 2050. And that may mean letting existing trees grow as much as possible, because existing trees, the IPCC in their 6th report, representing a consensus of global forest scientists, has said that letting the existing trees grow is the most beneficial thing we can do. And also, given the criticality of the next few decades, when you do a timber harvest, you're creating a carbon deficit. And this idea that the forest is renewable, it's renewable on the longer timescales. But if we don't get the next few decades right, 100 years from now, when those trees are maturing, it may be too late at that point. And another thought is, to what extent are the voices of indigenous people being included in this process? I think they have a lot to teach us about planning for the 7th generation, and the ways that they have been, globally, something like 80% of the intact biodiverse land is, I see I'm running out of time, so I'll cede the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Our next speaker is Michael Akrush.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Akrush. I'm a Massachusetts resident, and I'm a scientist and professor in environmental studies at Antioch University. I'm also an adjunct faculty at UMass Amherst. I strongly oppose any legislation that prohibits tree harvesting or other forest management, such as prescribed burning. I oppose any incentives for a lack of forest management and tree cutting on Massachusetts public or private lands. It's imperative that management is allowed in forest reserves. Forest management is not the same as cutting down a forest and putting houses there or putting agriculture there. When forest is cut down, young forest regrows after the harvest. And throughout the Northeast, this young managed forests are in decline. Wildlife that need this type of habitat, such as many state-listed species of conservation concern, like birds such as the eastern whippoorwill and prairie warblers, rare and endangered butterflies and moths, and rare plants and orchids. Many game birds and deer also need managed forests and a variety of young and older forests. Throughout the state, though, most forests are not managed and not harvested already. Less than 5% of Massachusetts lands are in a young forest state. And there are already many forest reserves throughout the state. So we need more managed forest lands, not fewer, to maintain biodiversity. There also seems to be a false dichotomous debate. Tree harvesting does not always negatively impact climate change because the carbon in harvested trees are partially stored in the wood products, as we've mentioned. And also carbon sequestration can increase in forests after tree harvesting, especially if there are dead trees that are thinned out. Additionally, there's a demand in Massachusetts for wood products, and climate change is a global problem. If trees are not being cut down here, they're probably being cut down elsewhere for our lumber, such as in the tropics, where there's higher biodiversity, rather than in Massachusetts. And we are still losing carbon storage in the global cycle and system if trees are cut down elsewhere and the demand is staying the same. So we're just outsourcing the same problem if we're keeping wood product demand constant, and we're just not letting our local Massachusetts forestry businesses economy and our wildlife and endangered species, we're not supporting them because they need forest management. So in conclusion, managed forests are needed to control insect outbreaks, such as southern pine beetle moving northward due to climate change, actually. And managed forests provide healthy forest stands for watersheds and reservoirs as well, and mitigate potential future climatic impacts such as wildfires. We need to be able to manage our forests with tree harvests, and I oppose any incentives for no management scenarios, as this will have adverse effects on environmental and wildlife conservation. If we don't harvest, we'll lose these rare wildlife species while the trees can regrow after a harvest. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is David King.
I don't believe I see David King's name.
Okay. Perhaps we can go back to Lenore Brick.
I'm here. I think I fixed it. Let's try. Let's try.
All right, we can hear you.
Okay. I appreciate this administration's efforts to change business as usual. I really do. But I'm hoping that we can also zoom out a bit together and kind of even see the irony of thinking of forests as climate solutions, as if we're separate from nature, which has always regulated the climate since the beginning, and that continued deforestation actually began the path to climate derangement. So I hope that we will bias nature's wisdom over our limited knowledge, that we will bias natural law over man-made laws, because we still have so much to learn. Climate chaos is a symptom. It's not the thing. It's a symptom of a systemic illness. It's the illness, arguably, of our disconnect from the earth, from ourselves. The othering, the separation that humans suffer from is evident in all our problems. And this overly simplistic lens that we have lacks nuanced understanding of natural systems. Nature is like beyond quantum physics, and we're like little monkeys piddling on our abacus. And finally, okay, we're finally talking about carbon sequestration and storage, but we don't mention all the symbiotic complex relationships, the hydrological cycles regulated by forests, and on and on. I appreciate that now biodiversity is mentioned and how it's impacted, but climate derangement didn't it's like the chicken and the egg thing that's not understood. I heard a great presentation today by Jonathan Thompson at the UMass Solar Forum. I recommend you all listen to that. He's talking about the unnecessary question and false choice of a carbon trade-off between solar and forest. It gives like a nice lens on this nuanced understanding. And I'm interested in how are you defining the latest climate science? Because I really hope that you're looking beyond the experiences of those that we've always depended on for land use management. Not that they don't have something to offer, but the forestry industry, we know, was in large part founded on an extraction model, understandably so, but thinking of forests providing products. And so I hope that you're looking to experts from a wide array of related fields that have no financial interest, no fear of like their, industry changing, people that understand hydrological cycles like Walter Jenney, soil scientists like Elaine Ingham, forest ecologists like Suzanne Samard. And thank you for realizing the importance of forest reserves and permanent protection, because we need intact, healthy, older forests. Thank you for including private and public landowners. I'd be interested in what are the incentives you will be offering to private landowners to support true land stewardship, appreciating it not be as lucrative as business as usual, but I think the rewards can be great for everyone. Like Mary Poppins said, enough is as good as a feast. One example I'd like to offer is education subsidies in coordination with other initiatives. Like one idea could be a collaboration between the many stakeholders and educators, including forested landowners and foresters, ecologists, regenerative farmers, conservation biologists, indigenous thought leaders, that can create and execute an agroforestry initiative across the state. I understand about durable wood products, they're great, but they don't have nearly the carbon storage potential that a healthy forest ecosystem offers, and wishful thinking will not make it so. And that still centers around our economic model that was referenced.
I'm gonna have to ask you to hold off now, since you're kind of way over the 3 minutes. If you want to continue speaking, it's possible to sign up again, and then we'll come back to you as we go through the list.
I'm done. I have one sentence left. So
thank you. Okay.
I wish us the courage to do this.
Thank you. Next speaker is Todd Waldron.
I just also reposted the list of speakers into the chat, including the link to sign up again, as well as the additional speakers that have signed up since the session began.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Susan, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and participate. My name's Todd Waldron. I'm the Forest Conservation Director with Ruffed Grouse Society in the Northeast. And, I'm looking at the framing question of what role should humans play in optimizing carbon storage and sequestration, kind of in a broader context of what role should humans play in optimizing climate solutions, since the panel here is about forests as climate solutions. And one thing is that, climate mitigation and adaptation, resiliency, biodiversity, and habitat are all interlinked issues. They're part of the same system. The wicked challenges that we face with those require human leadership and action and involvement, right? And urgency, I would say. And so thank you, everybody, for being here and contributing to the urgent need to address this. I was a member of the World Biodiversity Summit. I was a delegate hosted, it was back in Montreal back in December, where leaders, agencies, NGOs, and businesses across the world came together to address the biodiversity crisis, which is linked. And, one thing that really stuck with me was that addressing climate change effectively will be impossible without protecting, restoring, and responsibly managing our natural world. And so it's a multifaceted approach. There isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. And appreciate EEA's work on keeping broad toolkits in the toolkit here, and the expert panel that's working on climate forestry committee. There are 570 species of greatest conservation need in Massachusetts. The loss of habitat and forest age class diversity is one of the contributing factors, among others. We have a wide-ranging habitat decline across the Northeast and Massachusetts, and a lack of forest habitat diversity. And that's linked back to our ability to impact climate change the way we want to with forests. So maintaining a robust sustainability toolkit that includes both hands-on and hands-off approaches can be a very viable approach. This doesn't have to be an either-or dichotomy, as somebody else said. And we have the opportunity to have lots of tools in our toolkit here on behalf of our forests that we love and the wildlife and people. So we're happy to support forests' climate solutions, like expanding the protection and management and restoration of natural and working lands across the Commonwealth, both private and public, incentivizing the best science, working toward a cohesive approach that optimizes carbon storage and sequestration with other ecosystem benefits, as Christopher Borgatti had said, and working with partners to collectively find the right places and situations on where to manage and where to protect. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Matthew Sisk.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Good evening. My name is Matthew Sisk. I'm a member of the Fish and Wildlife Board, as well as the board's representative to the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Committee. I'd like to start out this evening by thanking the Healy administration and the folks under Secretary Cooper and Kurt Gardner for doing such a wonderful job in presenting this and making it a priority of this administration. This is not easy work. It's difficult work, and it's much appreciated by many people. I also think you've done a great job in explaining this, both to the public and to the stakeholders that are involved. Public meeting process is never easy, and the advisory committee's job is not easy, and I think they've done a great job in explaining that to the public as well as to the stakeholders, and I want to applaud you for that. Overall, my opinions on this matter are that this plan, like everything else, has good things and things that bring concern to me. But the two things that I'm most pleased with are that you are making habitat restoration and habitat management still a priority as it relates to that, as it relates to cutting. And I want you to know that's appreciated by me. I think keeping those especially for fish and wildlife lands, those two segments in there as part of this, from what I've read, are important. And again, I just want to thank you and my fellow board members and the staff at Fish and Game for all their hard work, and appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Bart Borisius.
Fortunately, I don't see Bart's name, but I think it's a good time to remind folks that if you did call in and your name is on the list, I don't have a way to cross-check phone numbers against lists. Oh, sorry, let me. I don't have a way to cross-check phone numbers against name signups. So if you send an email to guidelines@mass.gov with your phone number to confirm, I can give your phone number speaking permissions at that point in time. I think as a result of that, we can pass over Bart for now because I don't see Bart's name.
Okay, next speaker then is John Edwards.
Do not see John Edwards' name.
Okay, how about Chris Egan?
Thank you. This is Chris Egan. I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Forest Alliance. We represent forest landowners, foresters, timber harvesters, and forest products companies in Massachusetts. As you might expect, we weren't enthusiastic about the pause on forest management and feel that it is and was unnecessary during this process. But that being said, we have respect for the knowledge and experience of the members of the expert panel, and we appreciate the opportunity to comment. As we've heard tonight, some believe that no forest management at all should occur on state-owned lands, or at best it should be severely restricted. We believe that a mix of reserves and managed forests, as we have now, is the best strategy. And dozens of the largest and most prestigious environmental organizations in Massachusetts agree. and they have actually supported the continuation of sustainable forest management on state lands. In their environmental policy briefing book, sent to Governor Healy and other statewide candidates for office, in opinion articles published in local media and elsewhere. And the reason they're in alignment with us on this issue is quite simple. That's what the climate science says. And so we're glad that the Healy administration recognizes the strong science behind forest management, and that they've stated that they will continue to engage in sustainable forest management on state-owned lands once this process is completed. We do still have some concerns about the process and the potential end results. One concern about the guidelines is that with no representation on the panel from timber harvesters, unintended consequences could occur. For example, by restricting harvesting to a very low percentage of standing timber, the guidelines might make the actual harvesting of wood uneconomical for timber harvesters. And the state could find that when it puts out a forest management project out to bid, no bidders appear. We hope the panel will listen to harvesters, foresters, and others in the forest economy to identify these real-world effects and make sure they don't accidentally craft guidelines that would backfire and make management impossible. We also believe that our forests cannot be managed solely for carbon to the exclusion of all other ecosystem services, such as wildlife habitat and water quality. There needs to be some consideration for projects designed to address those issues, and we hope the panel will consider this as the guidelines are crafted. We have some additional thoughts on the guidelines of the process, which we'll include in written comments. Thanks for the opportunity to share our perspective.
Thank you. Next speaker is Ken Conkey.
And we've given you speaking permissions. If you are there and would like to begin.
You're muted, Ken. Okay, perhaps he stepped away. We'll try and come back to him. Let's go with Emma Ellsworth.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak tonight. My name is Emma Ellsworth. I'm the Executive Director of Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust. And then I'm also a member of the 7-person board of Mass Wildlife. And I am absolutely thrilled to hear about the statewide commitment to increasing the pace of conservation and to be thinking about the role that our forests play in this really new and innovative way to our overall climate health. Conservation is understood to be the leading natural solution to climate change. And so we have over 1 million acres of resilient landscape in Massachusetts alone that's at risk from development. So again, I'm really heartened by that commitment that I'm hearing as part of this process to increase the pace of conservation. I also want to share a really poignant recent victory is the wrong word for it, but news about the restoration of the frosted elfin, which is was considered an endangered species. And there was multiple years of work done in the Montague Plains to restore the habitat in the plains. That included the removal of non-native species. It included years of prescribed burning, and there was a flower in the seed bank that once it got sunlight, once the prescribed burnings were complete, was able to grow, and that enabled the frosted elfin to reemerge. And it wouldn't have done so otherwise. It was a species that we had lost from the state. So I know that there's a lot of concern about when we do management for resilience, for biodiversity that's been expressed on this call, but that's a perfect example of a success story. At Mount Grace, I also have the opportunity to work really closely with the Nipmuc cultural steward, Andre Strongbear Hart Gaines Jr. And he's talked a lot and shared with me and with my team the idea of restoring our relationship to nature, that one should be, that it's a give and take, that it involves gratitude and it also involves an active hand. And that active hand has been at play in our landscape for thousands of years. So an example like what happened in Montague, or the work that's being done around the Otter River in Winchendon, is an attempt to restore that relationship. And in doing so, we restore the resilience of our forest lands and our biodiversity. And I think it's really critical that we look to our forests, not just for a single thing like carbon storage, but for all the possible benefits of forest land, for peace, for recreation, for biodiversity, for clean water, for the air we breathe. And that when we make decisions, they have to be nuanced, and they have to factor all those pieces in. So again, thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. Thank you all for our time, and let's keep every tool in our toolbox.
Thank you. Next speaker is Kate Conlon.
Hi. The question, what role should humans play in the forest, is an interesting one, as it suggests we can decide this role when many of our impacts are already decided for us. Global trade and invasive species, climate change, legacy of land use, the built environment, and habitat loss. So what we end up discussing is really the philosophy of what is artificial and what is natural. I appreciate this collective process of thinking through what our public lands mean. I hope it ends up challenging the false dichotomies of natural and unnatural, wild and tame, and that the focus returns instead to place and people, and how these two things have always been intertwined in ways much more adaptive than most policies can provide. Therefore, I hope that any policy emerging from this allows for flexibility in our approach to stewardship and in our willingness to maintain all the cogs and wheels. I support management on state lands for all of the objectives you've listed. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Janet Sinclair.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, thanks. We just did an educational walk out in the Montague Plains. Kind of interesting that somebody mentioned the frosted elfin, and people speaking after me know more about this than I do, but it's actually not an endangered species. It actually isn't. It's just rare because it has a rare niche of habitat, and there are. That doesn't mean that it's endangered or ever was. It was spotted out there over just about a decade ago, according to Fish and Wildlife. I just wanted to just be clear that I don't think that that's an accurate portrayal of what's going on in the Montague Plains. I live near the Montague Plains, and people who live there are very upset about what's going on with the extreme heavy-handed management stuff that's going on in terms of just, well, you have to go see it. I don't want to really explain it here, but I would say that one of the things that I think about when we're looking at managing or whatever we do on our state land is that most people don't know that our state land is being logged. And I think and I'm sure of this, most people think that our state land is like a national park. And people are not running around complaining about national parks. People are not complaining, oh my God, there's national parks. Let's go out there and start harvesting. This is so mean and bad to leave land alone like this. It's just not fair. Nobody thinks that. And yet we don't have land that is set aside like a national park in Massachusetts. We have almost like 1% of our land is set aside as a reserve that's permanently protected by law. So my goal has always been, and I did help participate in the bills that Michael Kellett mentioned earlier. I'm very proud of my effort in that. We hope that we get more reserves on our state land. We hope that they become permanent. And I think that it's a little crazy if you think about the idea that the public owns this land, and yet it ends up being just a very small group of people that sits around and talks about what should happen on it. I think that it's time for the public to be able to speak and for the public to say that we would like land set aside as reserves, and that it should be our state land, our publicly owned land. And in terms of like what is a reserve, I think that the state right now, like DCR, has done a pretty good job of defining reserves and the policies that should happen on it. So I support DCR in that effort. I think it's totally reasonable on Fish and Wildlife land to have more reserves there and make them permanent as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is David Small.
Good evening. I really appreciate being able to share a few of my views this evening. I'm a lifelong naturalist. I've been looking at birds, butterflies, dragonflies, lots of other things for my entire life. I also spent my career at DCR and was a manager at the Division of Water Supply Protection. So I kind of know a little bit about management of forests and the pros and cons of a lot of this. The thing that I see that mostly that I see is I don't want to paint all of our lands with the same brush. You know, all these different acres are different and they all have their own thing that they're best capable of producing. Some of it may be carbon sequestration, some of it may be a particular habitat for a particular species. But that stuff is done, you know, on a very acre by acre kind of basis. And it's the people on the ground that actually go out and survey and know what's happening that are able to give good input into what's happening. So I just want to make sure that we don't, you know, paint everything with the same brush and continue to have a good mosaic of protected, you know, forest reserves plus highly managed areas for different purposes, and make sure that we keep that open. The other thing that I really it kind of gets me a little bit is that I'm sitting here in my wood house and there's all kinds of houses going up. I live in the town of Athol, and we've had more building permits in the last year than we've had in the last 10. And all of those houses are wood. And, you know, if we're not getting the wood from our own Massachusetts property, where are we getting it from? Are we getting it from South America? Are we getting it from Russia or Siberia? Where's that wood coming from? It's coming from places that don't have the same controls that we have on our forests. So I just want to make sure that people are realizing that we use forest products. You know, I heat with wood when it gets cold in the winter, but all these things are there. And I really feel that we shouldn't just think it's somebody else's problem, not my backyard kind of stuff. You know, we're responsible for the products that we bring into this country and bring into our state. And I think we should try to be sustainable within our own Commonwealth. So that's my basic thought. So thank you much for the opportunity, and I look forward to reading what comes up.
Thank you. Next speaker is Celeste Venelia.
I'm speaking today on behalf of the Sierra Club Massachusetts chapter to advocate for an end to logging on state-owned lands and legislatively designating them as permanent wildlands. As the name Forests as Climate Solutions Initiative suggests, we implore decision makers to remember that forests are the most effective at accumulating carbon when they remain intact and untrammeled by human management. The easiest way for Massachusetts to preserve large tracts of land and contiguous corridors is to commit to the immediate cessation of logging on state-owned land. We advocate for directing logging activity to private land by enhancing Chapter 61 incentives to provide local wood products and reduce the greatest threat to forest loss, which is development. This approach maximizes the carbon accumulation of forests in Massachusetts. During this summer of global climate records and disasters, we have seen that the urgency of protecting our natural lands is paramount. We support protecting public land in Massachusetts as reserves, where the definition of reserves is the same as the definition of wildlands in this year's Wildlands in New England report, free-willed, being allowed to develop without significant human intervention once designated. By defining reserves as shaped by natural processes, human intervention cannot be used to maintain reserve conditions. Only 2.3% of Massachusetts land base is currently protected from logging, and most of these wildlands are not permanently protected by statute. The application of active forest management to improve forest resilience to climate change is an experiment without controls and risks disrupting natural ecological processes. With disturbances like storm damage and increased pest outbreaks, there is little disruption of the underlying biogeochemical and ecological processes. Dead trees have value in forest ecosystems as habitat for many species. Preemptive logging and salvaging infected trees can release soil carbon, generate erosion, compact soil, damage other trees, and produce scarification. If the state is going to proceed with logging, we want to see the long-term data to support the forest management policies. Thank you for listening, and please make our public lands reserves open to visitation but free from logging.
Thank you. Next speaker is Angela Panassioni.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening. I would first like to start by saying that the argument that forests were untouched by humans for years is a complete farce. Indigenous tribes have managed forest lands in Massachusetts since time immemorial, and one of the most prominent ones is the controlled burns along the Quabog River. So with the Healy administration and the whole focus on environmental justice, by converting forests to reserves, you take away Indigenous people's opportunity to harvest traditional resources on the land. I have seen the success with reserves growing up and living in Brimfield. Brimfield State Forest is a reserve, and its resiliency in coming back after the tornado was dramatic in comparison with parcels very close by that were salvage logged. The whippoorwill's back, the choke cherry is back. Several species we haven't seen for years is back, but converting all public lands to reserves is not the best way to manage forests for climate change. We need to develop a carbon-informed forest management practice. Young forests sequester the most carbon, and old forests maximize the storage of carbon. Therefore, we need to focus more on a multi-age stratified forest that combines a mix of active and passive management in order to achieve that multi-age, multi-layer stratified forest that will be more resilient. Also, more focus should not be on turning public lands into reserves, but looking at ways to amend the current forest cutting practice regulations to focus on a more collaborative effort between private landowners, foresters, conservation organizations, and municipal officials to meet the needs of the specific towns and identify areas for landscape connectivity that should be reserved versus less productive forests that could serve as a source of local timber. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Brian Donahue.
Thanks very much. You can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thanks. So I'm co-author of all the Wildlands and Woodlands reports since 2005 and president of the Massachusetts Woodlands Institute. I also co-own a farm in Western Massachusetts where we do periodic timber harvest under a forest stewardship plan. In fact, our family built our house from timber harvested on our property. Now, we could argue forever about whether letting forests grow or sustainably harvesting them is better for storing carbon. I don't think anyone on this planet can answer that question because it all depends on what you count. There's good reasons to do both. They've little to do with carbon. As a society, as some people have said, we need wood. We live in houses. But we also need the other social and ecological benefits that forests provide. If we cut Massachusetts forests less, that will store more carbon in our forests, but unless we also reduce our consumption of wood, that just means more is being cut somewhere else, and it's all the same to the atmosphere. It's a shell game. By far the most meaningful thing we can do is to reduce our consumption of wood products and to shift our consumption and our production towards longer lasting products like timber and away from quickly oxidized paper and fuel. So for both our state forest lands and our forests overall, I'm among those who advocate a dual wildlands and woodlands approach, designate more wild reserves and harvest more timber. We have room and need for both. As for wildlands, we've called for at least 10% of Massachusetts to be designated as wild reserves by 2060. Presumably, a lot of that would fall on state land. But at the same time, we should also harvest more timber on state lands. We should make state-owned forest models of artfully combining wild reserves with ecologically sound management for timber. We should also vigorously promote and incentivize a similar approach on private lands. We should promote forestry that puts ecological values first, but that also, if practiced over wider acreage, can produce far more wood products than we are now, which is a tiny percentage of what we consume. It's about 5%. Again, neither designating more wildlands nor producing more wood within Massachusetts will dramatically change our climate impact. Only reducing and reconfiguring our rate of consumption can do that. But it will mean we take more responsibility for what we do consume, provide good jobs in the forest sector, and serve important ecological values at the same time. We can be a model, and not just an ecological model, but a social and political model of how these things work out. Designate more wildlands and protect more woodlands. Reduce our consumption of wood and produce more timber within our own state. These goals may sound contradictory, but they're not. In fact, they've been broadly endorsed by a wide range of environmental and forest industry groups in Massachusetts for the 20 years I've been part of this conversation. Let's put them into practice. Thanks.
Thank you. Next speaker is Marcelo Federico.
Don't see it as of right now. I'm just double checking. Yeah, I don't see Marcel's name.
Okay, J. William Stubblefield.
Don't see that name either. Again, if your name has been called and you're one of the call-in numbers, please send an email to guidelines@mass.gov with your name, and we can and confirm that it's your phone number, and we can coordinate that accordingly.
Okay, Betty Krikorian.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. My name is, excuse me, my name is Betty Krikorian. I'm a member of Elders Climate Action Mass and part of ECA's Natural Solutions team. Sorry, my comments on your framing questions relate to our public forests and would be somewhat different for privately owned forests. The primary role humans should play to optimize carbon storage and sequestration in forests is to enact laws and supporting policies to protect our forests from logging and other significant human perturbations. We maximize carbon sequestration and storage by allowing the forest to grow unimpeded and by not disturbing the forest floor and soils. Harvesting wood creates emissions and creates a sequestration deficit that lasts for decades. With regard to water, undisturbed forests stabilize the earth through their interlocked root systems, facilitate penetration of water into the earth, and result in more resilient trees. The water cycle that is slowed and directed into the earth supports the many small aquifers and the surface waters that Massachusetts depends on. Preserving the forest from intervention preserves our water supply and protects against flooding. Forests generally undisturbed by human intervention are also the basis of healthy, essential ecosystems that sustain native plant and animal life. With regard to wood products, humans should not disturb our public forests by seeking to produce wood products. The old Forest Service notion that public forests should be made productive by cutting down trees was perhaps a bad idea in the first place, but it certainly has no place in the circumstances we find ourselves in today and into the future. Experts from the IPCC to US policymakers to large numbers of scientists globally and in Massachusetts say that we need our forests today to sequester and store CO2, to provide the ecosystems that keep us alive, and to safeguard our water. With regard to the definition of reserves, I'll be brief. I would mention the definition that's in HD 4430, an act relative to forest protection, which prevents logging on public lands, as well as creating new fields, vistas, and wildlife openings, but does allow common sense and scientifically based management for dealing with pests, public health and safety, fire protection, and so forth. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Next speaker is John Slaff.
John Slaff is not in the list of attendees right now.
Okay, John Clark.
We do not see John Clark's name.
All right, how about Charles Thompson?
Do not see Charles Thompson's name.
Laura Haight.
Okay, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, people are dropping like flies, but we're sticking with it. And thank you for sticking with it. My name is Laura Haight. I'm the U.S. Policy Director for the Partnership for Policy Integrity, which is a nonprofit based in Pelham. We greatly appreciate this initiative of Governor Healy and support the expansion of Massachusetts forest reserves and the protection of our forests. This is a really huge opportunity for Governor Healy to create a model for other states around the country. Although to be fair, I think Zach Porter pointed out correctly, just to the state to the west, New York has really the best model, which is the forever wildlands in the Catskills and the Adirondacks. But those were set up for the preservation of open space and habitat, and not for the current crisis that we're facing, which is the climate crisis. They weren't set up for carbon sequestration. So we really do hope that Massachusetts develops a policy that other states can follow, and that's a strong policy. We support the definition and management priorities for forest reserves that are set forth in the two bills that have been mentioned prior to me, the HR H4430 and the H904. And I won't go into the details of how they define the reserve area, but we support those definitions. And in our testimonies advocating for the passage of those bills, our director, Mary Booth, wrote, "What we lack are intact ecosystems. In fact, we are severely deficient in systems that are just left alone to function in their unique and complex way. As a result, ecosystems are collapsing. We are losing insects, plants, and animals, even whole ecosystems. What has brought us to this point is business as usual, and more business as usual will bring us more destruction. We need a new approach. Putting state lands off limits to the destructive impacts of the forest products industry is a small step in the right direction. In fact, the amount of land that would be set aside is just a small portion of what biologists tell us is really needed to preserve the diversity of species." I'd like to sort of end with a concern that I have looking at the committee and listening to these comments. If the people who are developing this plan is, you know, your usual mix of academics, foresters, and large land trust or land conservation groups, you're going to get the same type of plan that any other state in the country will get. Every state is putting together those types of groups. You need to listen to the incredible expertise in the citizenry in Massachusetts, some of whom unfortunately didn't use their 3 minutes to speak today, but we need something that's bold, that's visionary, that's progressive, and that benefits all Massachusetts residents, not just special interests. So we look forward to continuing in this process, and we'll submit additional written comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker is Cable Eames.
Hi there. This is Cabell Eames. I work for Better Future Project. I am the political director. Thank you so much for having all of us here tonight. And I just want to endorse so much of what I've heard. I've learned a lot actually just by sitting here and listening to all these comments, so I can only imagine that you all are as well. I want to speak to the human intervention into forest reserves. I think that it's critical to maintaining the integrity and achieving our conservation goals. And to me, it involves a combination of protection and research and restoration and education and community engagement. And I think that they're all tailored to those specific needs. And the level of human intervention, well, that can vary widely, but the overarching aim, I think, is for us to strike a balance, right, between conservation and responsible use. And, you know, I also just want to speak to the fact that I think that we really need to be thinking about fire management as well as we get deeper and deeper into climate change. And one person had mentioned, and I'm sorry that I can't remember his name, but that we just need to leave them alone. And I want to speak to something that I've experienced firsthand, which is the, in my opinion, abuse of the Dover Amendment. The Dover Amendment came about in 1950. It was a response to local zoning bylaws that prohibited religious schools within like a town's residential neighborhood. And it was basically just intended to protect religious educational agencies from discrimination. But what I'm seeing happening is that schools are looking to build facilities, and so they're invoking the Dover Amendment, and cities and towns are powerless to them because they don't want to get sued. And then all of the neighbors are up in arms. Everyone is unhappy. And I'm seeing this time and time again. And to me, repealing archaic laws like that are low-hanging fruits to being able to reserve and protect forests. And that is just the one thing that I really want to leave you with, that I really strongly would recommend looking at that. There has been legislation to equally try to repeal it, but it is just becoming something that I really believe is being abused and should be repealed. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Andy Fenton.
Great, thank you. I'm Andy Fenton. I'm a forest ecologist with the Nature Conservancy. Thanks for the opportunity to provide input, and thank you for advancing this forward-looking initiative. I'm also really impressed with the thoughtful comments tonight. Regarding the role of humans, the Nature Conservancy supports a mix of forest reserves and sustainably managed forests on both public and private land as the best way to maximize the contribution of forests to address climate change, a wildlands and woodlands approach, as Brian mentioned. The most important actions to support forest benefits are to protect forests and reduce the pace of forest loss in Massachusetts, currently estimated at about 5,000 acres per year. We need to keep forested landscapes forested into the future, especially forests that are large, resilient, and well-connected, such as those defined in the new biomap. This will optimize carbon benefits as well as secure clean drinking water, reduce flood and drought risk, provide habitat and recreation, and supply wood products. The goal should be to optimize all of these values across the nearly 3 million acres of forest in Massachusetts, not on any single parcel. And regarding habitat, our state's rare species require a variety of habitats, and some need active restoration and management to survive and thrive. Our Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program, with others, do an outstanding job defining and implementing these practices for over 400 rare species. For thousands of other native species in Massachusetts, we need to, again, ensure we protect existing forests and designate some as reserves. The Nature Conservancy's definition of forest reserves is where natural processes are the dominant force, defining forest structure, composition, and ecological processes. This is a similar definition used by DCR and in the recent Harvard Forest Wildlands report. The definition is not about a specific age class, structure, or composition. It's about a management regime. Old growth forest conditions are one desired outcome of both reserves and in some cases of active management. The vulnerabilities listed in the question will be reduced again by protecting large and resilient forests and reducing forest loss. These landscapes will support the ability of plants and animals to adapt and evolve over time and in response to climate change and other threats. Reducing threats actively, such as invasive plants, insects, and tree diseases, and controlling deer populations will also help our forests be more resilient. And finally, the Nature Conservancy helped define climate-smart forest management practices that increase carbon stocks while helping forests adapt, including in degraded lands that benefit from restoration. We suggest drawing from this list of practices where possible. Thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you. Next, we have Priscilla Lynch.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. I would like to speak to keeping all of our state lands as reserves. I think the problems that we know the problems that we are having now are because of human intervention and human exploitation of our resources and our world. And there really isn't anything to indicate that we are doing or can do differently. I think that my biggest concern is that we are trusting in DCR to make the proper choices about our public lands and loggings. And I would just invite you all out to Conway to come and see the logging that was just approved by DCR on private land. You won't need permission from the landowner to see it. It's right along the road and the whole length of the road. And you'll see what they did last year. You'll see what they did this summer. Saw those logs go to Canada. And if this is who we are trusting as our human interveners on our behalf, I think we need to really think about that. And I think if you saw this, you might think about it too. So please come out and look and see for yourselves what our public agency is approving on private lands and what they will approve on public lands. And we need to protect ourselves from that, and that our common lands should be reserved and should not be manipulated. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker is Kate O'Connor.
Hi. I'm going to speak to your questions. So for question 1, what role should humans play? Humans should leave large areas of forests alone with permanent protection for the forests to manage themselves as they have done for millions of years to provide the climate creating and regulating service of breathing in carbon dioxide and storing the carbon in the soil, roots, trunks, and branches. Without human management, forests allowed to grow old provide the easiest and best solution for long-term removal and storage of carbon, thereby helping to heal the climate crisis for free. Forests provide habitats for 80% of the world's wildland species. Forests provide cooling shade, reduced air temperatures. Intact, unmanaged forests create the healthiest soils, which slow down and absorb rainwater, prevent flooding, erosion, and they help fill our underground reservoirs. Forest reserves should be permanently protected and left unmanaged. Human chainsaw management causes worse forest fires and harms the soil organism networks that trees depend on for their health. Logging and thinning allows more invasive species, bugs, diseases, and weather events to invade and harm the forests. Most of Massachusetts was covered with forest before European immigrants cut them down. Originally, forest openings were naturally created by beavers and weather events, including fires. These provided habitats for the species that need open land and transitional forest growth areas. There is plenty of logging done already on private lands here in Massachusetts. It's required by Chapter 61. This can provide for the species that belonged here historically and need these non-forested and young forest habitats. All of our public forest lands should be converted to permanently protected, non-managed forest reserves and allowed to grow old to help heal the climate crisis, which is far more important than managing our small amount of public forests with thinning and logging for non-endangered and game species. Unmanaged forests are the most resilient, the most fire, disease, and pest resistant, and are best able to adapt to climate challenges. I urge everyone to support the current bills in the legislatures that will create permanent unmanaged forest reserves on Massachusetts public forest lands and allow the forest to regrow on all the public lands that have been forested. Logging companies are already among the largest landowners in the state, and they can provide much of the wood necessary for providing durable wood products, which we all need. Trees give us our breathable air and a decent climate for free when we let them be. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Susan Purser.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great, thank you. Good evening. My name is Susan Purser from Beckett. I'm the coordinator of Preserve October Mountain. Thank you for this opportunity for public input. I greatly appreciate that Governor Healy has carried out the moratorium and this review process as she promised she would on the campaign trail. Tonight, I'll address question number 2. I strongly support the concept of placing all of our public forests in the reserve category, as this optimizes them for sequestration, biodiversity, pest resilience, recreation, and connectivity with other wildlands. The reserve designation would leave the forest to their natural processes with no logging allowed except in cases of public safety. DCR's proposed ant lot logging project of 300 acres in October Mountain Forest is a good example of why the protection of reserve is needed. This project, under the woodlands designation, proposes to cut 8 5-acre circles in one section of the forest with associated roads or paths connecting each circle. This fragments that part of the forest like Swiss cheese and compacts the forest floor and makes it more vulnerable to fire, invasive species, loss of habitat, and may damage or eliminate a beautiful trail in that area. This management does nothing constructive for sequestration, wildlife, or recreation. In addition, under the same ant lot plan, DCR proposes to cut the ash trees along West Branch Road as they may have the emerald ash borer. Cutting the ash trees is unnecessary as natural processes should be allowed to take its course. Cutting the trees only spreads the ash borer to new areas when it is carted away and leaves a pretty road into October Mountain as unsightly and ugly. I am afraid that when the moratorium ends in a few months, that the logging contract will be signed and the logging machinery will move in. Why shouldn't our beautiful and very popular forest not have the protection offered by a reserve? That's a question that I would put to the committee. You know, such a popular forest should not be logged at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Sasha Simone.
I don't see Sasha's name.
Okay, how about Julie Caswell?
Do not see Julie's name.
Nancy Poland.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you for the opportunity to make comments tonight. My name is Nancy Poland. I'm from Southampton and an active member of the Sierra Club. I am an advocate for an end to logging on state-owned lands and legislatively designating them as permanent wildlands. Leaving state forests unmanaged and allowed to mature and grow old will optimize carbon storage and sequestration and create large contiguous wildlife corridors. I appreciate your plans to increase forest reserves. Designating all state forests as reserves shaped by natural processes would bring us closer to our 30-30 goal and our emissions reductions goal. In the midst of climate destabilization, with more frequent and extreme weather events, no one knows what our forests will look like in 2050. In response to your question number 3, what should we do to make our forests more climate resilient? The short answer, do very little or nothing. We have no idea which tree species will survive. We know that logging degrades forests and increases atmospheric carbon. Logging to replace tree species X with species Y, or to make forests younger, or to favor a few species, removes the ability of forests to serve as a climate solution. There is an important new research report out about the climate regulating role of forests, how they regulate rain, pump water through the biosphere, and cool the planet. The climate regulation of forests is not well understood and should be incorporated in our policymaking. The conclusion of the report is that because we don't know enough about how forest ecosystems work, the precautionary principle should be strictly applied. When in doubt, do little or nothing. The report continues with, quote, the global climate price of losing a hectare of natural forest grows as the climate situation worsens. We call for an urgent global moratorium on the exploitation of the remaining natural ecosystems and a broad application of the pro-forestation strategy to allow them to restore to their full ecological and climate regulating potential. Imagine every hectare or 2.5 acre stand that is logged in Massachusetts degrades our forests and increasingly worsens the global climate situation. I implore you to remember this as you write climate guidelines. For every 2.5 acres of natural forest that is logged, the global climate price increases and climate worsens. Our state forests have impacts on climate, on carbon storage, on water quality that extends far beyond our state borders. Thank you for listening tonight.
Thank you. Next.
Can I pause really quick? I believe a number of folks are having some technical difficulties through the way. If you were forwarded a link to attend the session, it's likely showing up as in the attendees as the name of the individual who forwarded you the link. And as a result, I think that there are some folks who are not appearing, even though we're attempting to call on them. For those folks who are in attendance, but whom we passed over because we didn't see their names in the list, could you please re-register for the session on the website? And I can put the link for re-registration in the chat. And hopefully we can call on you accordingly as a result of that. One of those individuals was Bill Stubblefield, and if appropriate, Susan, I believe it may make sense to circle back.
Do you want to circle back right now? Do you have a way of getting him access?
Yeah, this is one person I think that was affected by this.
Okay, there is also in the chat a phone number for Sasha Simone. So maybe we'll go to Bill and then we'll go to Sasha.
Yeah, I believe there's a chance that Sasha needs to re-register as well as a result of the same potential forwarding piece. So I'm gonna and I think that there's at least one, if not a couple other folks who have been subjected to that. So if you are in attendance and you heard your name called, but we weren't able to identify that you were in attendance, please try to re-register and we can try to correct that situation.
Caroline, I just want to make sure your instructions here are clear to those folks who might be having this problem. If we're asking them to re-register, are you asking them to leave the webinar and come back in?
That is what will happen. If you register using the name and your own email address, it will give you a link to rejoin the webinar, and you will rejoin with the name in which that Susan was calling aloud.
Okay. Okay. A little bit complicated, but I think it's possible.
Kind of just where we are, we've got probably about 8 more on the initial list, and then we've got about 8 more that signed up since we started. And I've got circles around the names of people who weren't able to connect, so I can go back to them at the end. So I think, so are we gonna have Bill Stubblefield now?
Yeah, all right, Bill, you have speaking permissions now.
Hi, I guess I finally am. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I will deal with 3 questions in order. Question 1, basically we are being asked to solve an economic allocation problem where only wood products have a recognized monetary value, as if we could smoothly exchange a little less biodiversity or carbon sequestration for a little more wood products or vice versa. But this is not a sensible way to think about this. There can be no civilization itself, much less a wood products industry, in the absence of a functioning biosphere. Indeed, we find ourselves in an existential struggle for a livable future, and we must move away from thinking of nature as natural resources to be exploited for private gain, and move instead to a vision of nature as a life source to enrich our common welfare. Fortunately, aside from exploitative uses, all the benefits forests provide are maximized by leaving them alone to get on with the job. This is the optimal way to care for the lands we hold in common. Question 2. Forest reserves should be defined as permanently protected areas where nature is allowed to develop to its fullest potential. In short, reserves are areas maintained as forever wild, where human interventions are minimal and only if necessary for ecological protection or human health, safety, or welfare. Interventions to protect vulnerable habitat or species should be permitted only for compelling reasons, and then at only the smallest suitable scale, with careful monitoring and a comparable untreated control site whenever possible. Question 3. The projected likelihood that changes already underway will degrade the potential of our forests, but this applies to all forests, not just reserves. And the direct consequences of climate disruption will also impact the built environment and the wood products it contains. Available evidence indicates that it is intact, older forests that are best equipped to survive these assaults. If forest growth is compromised, then so is the level of sustainable harvests. And I had quite more, but
I appreciate your respect for the timer, given how many people are still waiting to speak.
Susan, I went through the list of everyone else to see if anyone had re-registered, and I believe Sasha Sloan is now registered under their name.
Okay, so let's go to Sasha Simone.
There you go.
Hello, thank you for letting me speak. I appreciate that. I'm just giving a general comment. Actually, I'd like to tell a story to everybody who's on this call. I am a resident of Melrose, Massachusetts, and I have been going to a local forest in Wakefield for the last 45 years. I know that forest, or I should say I knew that forest probably better than most of the animals that visited or lived in that forest. I was that intimate with that that location and that land. And because of a few people who decided that they wanted to destroy the forest, it just, I guess in the last week, the entire ecosystem and every tree that I was intimately in love with, and all the animals and bugs are just gone to build a school where there's already available land to build that school. And we tried for over a year and a half to stop the destruction of the forest. And I've heard everybody say, you know, we need to do things differently. And there's too many loopholes. There's not enough oversight. There's not enough people that care about money takes precedence, and development and Dover amendments and, you know, lawyers and loopholes. These forests that have no voice, and the citizens who want to save these forests, we just don't have any choice. We're just told, you know, too bad. There's other forests available. And if we continue down this path of just blatant disrespect and disregard, I mean, we can talk about all we want, but nothing is going to change. And the forest that I loved is now gone. The school will go up, the stormwater will be polluted, and all the animals and bugs and everything that live there and all those beautiful trees are just gone. So I don't know. I mean, we can say all we want, but actions speak louder than words, and I don't see anything happening. So I hope, you know, I hope we can make differences in the future and try to change the way that this is happening. But I fear for any land that is not going to be developed will be even existing. I just don't know what the future holds. Thank you.
Thank you. Next name on the list is Lexi Dewey.
I don't see Lexi's name here.
All right, and the next is John McDonald, who put a message in the Q&A saying that he had to leave but would send in written comments. So the next name is Steve Sears.
Hello, and thank you for offering this to the whole state of Massachusetts, and thank you to Stephanie and Kurt, and thank you to everyone who's so passionate about this. I think the one thing to remember for all of us who might have differing opinions is we all care about this, and it's important to listen to each other through this process. I am from Dalton, Mass. I am the Western District Representative on the Board of Directors of Mass Wildlife, and I am the Chairman of the Board of Mass Wildlife currently. In terms of what can humans do, what can we do? The single thing that we can do, I believe, as a state is to purchase and protect as much land as possible. The management of that land is an issue that we're all talking about, but if we don't have the land, then we can't manage it. And so providing for the purchase of open land and funding the stewardship for that land, I believe is vital. I also think that one of the things that we can do that is not, I have not heard in this discussion at all, but I have mentioned it to Kurt in the past, is we have policies in our state which are putting pressure on developing open space rather than redeveloping existing buildings in urban and suburban areas. And that has to do with building codes. And if you think about reusing existing buildings and how utterly impossible and costly it is because of our building codes, which we totally control through our politics, that stuff there causes development to go into buying green spaces and putting up schools, just as that person was just speaking about before me. So that's completely within our control and not talked about in this discussion, which I hope gets into the dialogue of this, because it's simply it will have a major effect. I strongly believe in habitat management for species and biodiversity. I think that this is important. And when you think about that from a forestry management point of view, we're talking about a minor amount of the forest to preserve the biodiversity. And so let's see. Safety things are super important. I'm going to run out of time, but we have to plan for fire, as you see in Hawaii, wind and hurricane effects as well. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just want to note that it's 8:21 and we're scheduled to go to 8:30. We've got about 9 or 10 more speakers if they're here.
So Susan, let's do this, given the time. We are willing to stay within reason. We're willing to stay until 9 o'clock to hear people out. But for those who need to get off right at 8:30, we have the wrap up slide here. So I just want to say that I have been really just so impressed with the thought that people brought to these questions, and everything that we're trying to undertake here. And really people have given us so much so many good ideas, thoughtful perspectives. For if we heard one side of a coin, we heard the other, but all done in a respectful way, really explaining here's what I think you should do and here's why, and here are the trade-offs. And I think that it's just really helpful. I won't say more just in the interest of time, but I do just want to thank people for everything tonight. So on the wrap up, for those who need to get off right away, our webpage is here, which we'll have background updates. We'll have the recording for this meeting. We've talked about written comments already, but just a reminder, we do have a form on the webpage where you can submit written comments. We're going to take sort of the first batch that comes in by this Friday and review and consider those, but we will accept comments on an ongoing basis. Later in this process, later in the fall, we do anticipate releasing a draft set of guidelines for review and comment, and then hosting another input session. We've added to our website the ability to sign up for, to subscribe for updates. So you can do that on our webpage if you want to, be sure that you're getting a notification from us when there's something new or a new opportunity for input. And then also, just if you have any additional comments or questions or anything that you want to share with us, you can always reach us at guidelines mass.gov. And so with that, I would propose that we then resume the comments and go through the rest of the list through 9 o'clock if it requires that much time.
Okay, thank you. We'll just keep going. Next speaker then is Dickon Crane.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. I'm Dickon Crane. I'm the chairman of the Woodland Partnership of Northwest Massachusetts. And it's a 21 town region that is 83% forested. A large portion of that is state-owned land. And it is declining significantly in population as the whole is in population. And it's an example of the impact that taking land out of an economic, sort of the rural economic situation is causing harm to these communities, and that the land stay forested is absolutely the goal of the partnership, but that the land be able to support the communities where the state-owned land is, particularly in that 21 town region, is very important. It's as important as any of the other ecosystem services and climate issues, is that you can't separate those benefits from the impacts they have on the communities where those benefits are generated. And I think it's very important that this be considered as part of the human impact, is that there is an impact on the people who live in these highly forested areas, and that they be able to have a sustainable future in the region where these forest lands are. And I think that the partners in the partnership, or each of the towns, have a representative. There's all the land trusts in the area have representatives. The watershed organizations do the regional planning, do the Okatoa Cultural Center has a seat in the partnership. And so it's a very broad organization of people in this area. And I think that it's important to recognize that their voices need to be heard as a part of how this forest as a climate solution moves forward. That it's important to recognize that it has big impacts on these communities. And in a state that's gaining in population, in the area where all the forest is, we're losing population. So that's something that has to be recognized. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Emily Boss.
I do not see Emily Boss's name in the list.
Okay, Mike Roach.
I'll also post remaining speakers.
Hello,
Link at the bottom.
I'm here.
Yes.
And I've spent the last 6 decades walking through the woods and forests of Massachusetts as much as I possibly can. I've learned a lot over that period of time, and the forests have changed a lot in that period of time. I spent 50 years as an educator. I worked for the world's largest conservation organization, Ducks Unlimited. I spent 35 years on the Massachusetts Fisheries and Wildlife Board and have seen those forests from a whole lot of different perspectives. One thing I've not heard a lot of this evening is the fact that those wildlife, the primary purpose in my mind of those forests is wildlife habitat. And I think it's critically important that we have a diverse ecosystem, and active forestry is a big part of that. So I strongly support active forestry because I believe that managed forests are healthy forests. I believe that wildlife, birds, insects, many of them endangered or rare species, depend upon that changing forestry habitat. And it has to happen somehow. Before the Europeans came here, that happened through forest fire, it happened through winds, it happened through a whole lot of ways. And then basically now we're responsible for making that forestry change. And that disruption of forest that's done by forestry, I think, is extremely important to a lot of wildlife and wildlife species. So to me, a managed habitat is a healthy habitat. And I think active management and forestry on our public lands is just as important as it is on private lands. And I hope that we all understand that going forward, that wildlife management, forestry management has changed a lot in the last 50 years, and it will continue to change. And what is decided now is only a benchmark, a bookmark, if you will, and things are going to go forward. So I hope that these discussions like tonight continue so that various opinions can be heard and acted on. But I don't think any of the extremes that have been noted tonight are advantageous. I think we have to find a way to manage our resources to the good of not only all of us, but to the wildlife of the Commonwealth. Thank you.
Thank you. I understand that Emily Bowes is here.
Hello, thank you so much. Sorry for the mistyping of my name. I appreciate the time that everyone's giving to these important issues and all the thoughtful commentary that's been given this evening. My name's Emily Boss. I'm the Conservation Community Program Manager at Franklin Land Trust and the Executive Director at Mass Woodlands Institute. I'll keep my comments brief. As a conservation organization, we at Franklin Land Trust urge you and thank you for your commitment to increase the pace of conservation as the first step towards forest climate response. It's incredibly important to keep forests as forests. We also urge you to prioritize supporting Indigenous nations' access to land and rematriation as reparations for historic and present land loss and theft and genocide. It's just the right thing to do. And these are also climate responsible choices, as the IPCC and others have shown that Indigenous presence on land and relationship and stewardship is a strong way to ensure climate resilient stewardship of the land. We also hope that you will follow science-informed stewardship actions, such as those recommended by the IPCC and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. These include wildlife resilience and carbon-focused pathways, such as those outlined in the Healthy Forests for Our Future by the Nature Conservancy and other partners, as well as continue to expand and make more permanent the protection and provision for wildlands in our state. We hope that you will place forest climate response in the larger context of greenhouse gas emission reduction by all sectors of the economy, and not expect our forests to do the work of every single response. And also, we are glad that we are continuing the tradition of, and hope that this will continue, of leading the way in forest research and conservation planning, which Massachusetts has brought historically, by funding wise management of public and private woodlands, as well as the protection of wildlands, and do so with emphasis on access to natural lands by all people, which means reducing barriers and undoing historic removals of land from BIPOC communities and members. and balancing the integrity of natural communities with the creation of energy efficient, sustainable, and vibrant human neighborhoods and communities. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Susan, there's another individual who was having significant technical issues previously that also was just able to join with their name, if it would be okay to allow that person to speak.
Yes.
Bart Boresius.
Unmute. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm just going to launch into this so we don't waste time. I suggest that there is a preconceived notion in this session that management guidelines, which are voluntary, by the way, would be particularly useful in mitigating climate change. Such an incredibly narrow focus means that it has already been determined that forest management, which uses logging as its primary tool, has already been chosen to respond to the climate emergency. There is a consensus among climate scientists that leaving forests basically undisturbed will ultimately sequester and accumulate more carbon in the time we have left to meaningfully respond to climate change. The more forests that are left undisturbed, the more effective we will be. Therefore, we need to protect larger portions of forests from logging to the greatest extent possible. Exactly how to log the remaining forests is trivial in comparison to cutting back on the logging, which is overwhelmingly the largest source of tree mortality, according to forest ecologist Charles Canham of the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies. Canham notes in his recent book, Forests Adrift, how ecologists differ from foresters as a general rule. The vast majority of ecological research, this is in quotes, ecological research on logging has focused on detrimental environmental impacts. In contrast, I think it is fair to say that both academic and practicing foresters are motivated by the conviction that their actions improve forest health. I've long felt that these very different perspectives reflect diametrically opposed but very deep-seated beliefs about the proper role of humans in nature. When looking through the lens that sees forest health only in terms of producing economically valuable trees for harvest, it is difficult to imagine that an ecosystem might use natural selection of trees and all the other species of beings that make up a natural wild forest ecosystem, as opposed to logging equipment, to ultimately produce a healthier, better adapted forest for the future of our planet. The idea that we should manage and have dominion over nature is a fundamental aspect of why we are suffering rampant pollution, mass extinction, and climate change that together threaten our future as a species. Forestry, which was developed to serve the forest products industry, therefore must not be the narrow frame through which we respond to climate change and other existential threats. Finally, I agree with Kurt Gertner with his concern that data is critical. Just half a second. So I urge the EEA to insist that keeping data on the carbon impact of DCR and DFW as opposed to that of preserved wild forest be that data be collected and compared. Thank you. I'll put more in written testimony.
Thank you. I'm going back to the list now. We've got Hannah Harvester.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thanks so much for staying a little longer. Many people have spoken and said a lot of things that I'll say in written testimony, but I think what I've heard the least about is that we are in a climate emergency, and that the time frame is urgent. We have, maybe between 5 to 7 years to try to reduce emissions and sequester carbon to the point that we might be able to, meet that 1.5 degree goal, which is the bare minimum according to the IPCC of what we should be aiming for. Much past that, and we may not have, the children that we all love so much, may not be able to live full, complete lives. So, right now we're just talking about state land. And as people have pointed out, it's a very small percentage of the forest. So, sounds like there's plenty of land for cutting down trees that the state has no control over. Absolutely, our state lands, yes, they should be in a reserve. As so many people have pointed out, that's the best way to sequester carbon. It's the least we can do in terms of this little piece of the puzzle. But if we're to have even a small chance of children who are alive today having decent lives, children that we know and love, we need to be in emergency mode, and we need to be preserving the forest that we are able to preserve. Thanks.
Thank you. Next up is Susan Messino.
Good evening. My name is Susan Messino. I'm from Pittsfield, went to college in Massachusetts. I'm currently a professor of applied science at Trinity College, and I did a forest research fellowship at Harvard a few years ago. I'm calling in tonight. I'm not against anything specific. I'm a experimentalist, but I absolutely support, and so do scientists that are theoretical physicists, ecologists, climate scientists, public health experts, more forests and reserves, and prioritizing that for our public land. And I know the discussion is always that this is so complicated, but it's not that complicated. We need to divide our forest into 3 different buckets. Where are we providing for natural processes, which is critical for everything we all need? It's our platform for evolution, our library of molecules and species and interactions and medicines we haven't discovered, and refuge for people and everything that we all need. So that's one bucket. We definitely need more research. We have no idea if what we're doing is sustainable. We haven't been doing it for long enough. We keep on changing methods and strategies. So we absolutely need control groups. We need baselines, and we need to even understand our variables. We just have so little handle on that. That needs to be a priority. And we also need areas for resources. So we all accept that. No one is opposing, I think, any of these 3 categories, but we need to really get very quiet and very serious about a medical ethic related to these ecosystems, which are the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. They play an incredibly important role in stabilizing the global and local temperature, in both because of carbon and also because of water cycles. And I'm glad that someone brought that up as well. I would encourage you to look up the concept of the biotic pump. It's not well accounted for in climate models, and it's a very powerful force. So our public lands are our common public treasure. And the first thing we need to do is decide, like in a triage system, where are we going to do no harm? And right now, that needs to be as many areas as possible. So I'm going to answer question 2 first. What's your definition or concept of forest reserves? And what's the role of human intervention? The definition in the recent Wildlands report, the definition in the current reserves is a good definition, and it should be a first do no harm attitude. Any intervention would have to be proven to have a net benefit to consider the risk of that intervention. And our interventions now are spreading invasives, compacting the soil, spreading Lyme disease, upsetting people, and a whole bunch of other things. We need to prove that there should be a proof that there's a net benefit. What role should humans play in optimizing?
I'm going to have to ask you to stop, because you did your 3 minutes.
Sorry.
And you're trying to give everyone at least a
Oh,
minimum.
I'm sorry. Sorry
No
about that.
problem. Okay, thank you. John Scanlon.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, well, thanks so much for this opportunity. I am retired from a 40-year career spent in forestry and wildlife conservation in both the public and private sectors. I'm proud to have been involved in both the conservation of a lot of forest land in terms of being conserved in open, the public lands for long-term conservation, and to have been involved in literally tens of thousands of acres of management for declining wildlife species. Now, we all share a common goal for climate change mitigation, but stopping the harvest of renewable wood products on Massachusetts state lands ultimately does not get you there. It's fine to take a look at this option, but consider that the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, found that a combination of global forest reserves and sustainably managed forests managed for a diversity of ecosystem benefits, including clean air and water, carbon storage, and renewable wood products, will yield the highest global carbon benefits over the long term because of the ability to mitigate carbon-emitting disturbance events and to store carbon long term in harvested wood products such as mass timber, wood building construction. The United Nations IPCC found that sustainable forest management can lower greenhouse gas emissions, enhance forest carbon sequestration, and maintain forest carbon stocks better than forest reserves alone. Now, a big part of the reason for this is because humans use a lot of natural resources, and substituting alternative materials like steel and concrete for wood often has worse climate impacts than using wood. And make no mistake that reducing local harvest of renewable wood products shifts harvesting to other states and nations with less social and environmental protections than we enjoy here. And this in turn causes negative environmental justice impacts on the human societies and environments that we import our wood products from. We should shoulder our own burdens and not shift them onto others. It would be great to see the Healy administration establish economic incentives to stop converting forest land to development, and to see the administration meet our increasing needs for more low and moderate income housing using local wood and local workers to retrofit brownfields across Massachusetts cities and towns instead of converting more forest land to new development. That would be climate smart policy. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Matthew DeBona.
Good evening.
Hi.
My name is Matt DeBona. I live in Belchertown, Massachusetts, and I'm a biologist with a national conservation organization called the National Wild Turkey Federation. We have over 1,000 members in Massachusetts, and we're based around the conservation of the wild turkey and the habitats that it depends on, and that includes forests. We are excited and supportive of Governor Healy's focus on combating climate change and leveraging our forests as a climate solution to help offset our carbon emissions and help the Commonwealth reach net zero by 2050. But how we get to net zero matters. Our forests provide important services like carbon storage and sequestration, wildlife habitat, clean water, and forest products, among many others. The management objectives and activities that provide these services are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they do sometimes require us to consider trade-offs. It's our belief that it is important that state and private forest lands continue to provide all of these important services and benefits. And we should not prioritize one benefit or service over all others across all of our public lands. Instead, we should prioritize the forest conditions that are going to give us healthy, resilient forests to provide all these important services in the face of climate uncertainty. And to do that, we're going to need active management, at least in some cases, to help us get to old growth forest conditions faster, to give us the young forest that many wildlife species depend on, and to increase the structural complexity and diversity of our forests. not to mention to allow us to sustain sequestration benefits through time. With regards to forest reserves, they are definitely a tool in the toolbox, and we advocate that maximum flexibility be given to agency land managers to allow them to adapt and respond to future uncertainties and threats, such as changing climate conditions and invasive insects and diseases. While forest reserves can be an important tool to preserve natural communities and ecological processes, the increasing frequency and intensity of forest disturbances and stressors may limit realized benefits in the complete absence of management. Lastly, in regards to our public spaces and our public lands, these are the places where we can do the best forestry, to leverage expertise and to work at a landscape scale to rehabilitate degraded woodlands, provide habitat for threatened and rare species, and demonstrate the best silvicultural practices to educate landowners and foresters. They should be field classrooms. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comments, and we look forward to participating in this process in the future.
Thank you. Next speaker is Peter Rayton.
I see two Peters in attendance, which might have been a link forward as well. I'll try both, and hopefully one of them is the right Peter.
Okay, looks like he's here.
Peter, I
Peter?
see you're unmuted. Is this the right Peter? Perhaps I can try the other Peter. Is this the right Peter?
I would suggest we move on, and then if the Peter who was trying to speak didn't get recognized, to just please notify us in the Q&A.
Okay, let's go to Tim Hawley.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to comment. Keeping forests as forest is definitely a high priority. The goal for managing state-owned land should be to do it in a way that protects more land from conversion to non-forest. That is more of the 2.7 million acres that have no protection now. And secondly, in thinking about how we manage our land, I would recommend reading The Illusion of Preservation by Kittredge and Foster. We import 96% of the wood that we use in this state. And as has been pointed out, if we don't use the wood that we're growing ourselves, we have to get it from somewhere else. Only 15% of the wood grown in Massachusetts each year is being harvested. About twice as much wood is lost to decay from trees dying than is harvested. In 1973, the median house size per occupant in the US was 507 square feet. By 2015, it had grown to 971 square feet. So we're building bigger houses and having fewer people live in them. One of our goals for reducing our climate impact and protecting forests should be to find ways to expand housing on land that is not forest or farmland. Several other people have mentioned the need to retrofit existing housing. As far as reserves go, I think we have to think carefully about where it might be beneficial to allow forest processes without our intervention. We will someday have another hurricane like that of 1938, and if it is followed by a drought, we could have fires like we are seeing now in other parts of the world. As for carbon storage, I have walked through some of the land burned in preserved areas such as Yellowstone National Park and Baxter State Park in Maine. And that is not a way to sequester carbon. When an unmanaged forest burns intensely, you lose a lot of carbon that might otherwise have been stored for a very long time in buildings. National parks in the United States are about 2% of our land area. 10% for permanent reserves seems too high. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I just want to, I'm sorry, Susan, I just want to say as we're going to the next person that the rest of the list may take us a little bit past 9 o'clock, but we would like to stay on if you'd like to still share your comments with us. And we are heartened that so many people are still on the call, sticking with this and listening to these really thoughtful comments. So let's keep going.
All right. Next speaker is Fred Hayes. Mr. Hayes?
Okay, let's start over. Sorry. Thank you very much. As Hayes Family Forest, we manage our family lands and our client lands, the majority of which are protected by conservation restrictions. As Hayes Forest Products, we manufacture forest products for our local and regional markets. We are already in a climate impact period. During the period, what we've noticed is that our stands need a lot more attention on a more regular basis. I think this is going to change how we go forward. This is no longer a 10-year management plan. This is now 10-year stands more regularly, check in, see what's going on, and be adaptive as you go forward. Our forests will need careful attention to species composition, pest management, and attention to changes in regeneration. Our white pine stands in our region are now dramatically impacted by white pine needle drop, and we've had to adjust the airflow through the stands. This level of attention is going to require a lot more staff on state land, and I'll submit more comments written, but I would like to let other people talk.
Thank you. Next, we have Ariana Karigatam.
Hi, good evening. I'm Aranya Karigatam, and I'm 16 years old. My brother and I enjoy taking walks in nature and love observing wildlife. We learn from our own observations that birds, insects, and other animals and plants are crucial components that have interconnected relationships with their environment to keep the ecosystem functioning. If any component is removed, the whole ecosystem will collapse. Unfortunately, throughout Massachusetts, forests are being destroyed for logging, solar farms, and MSBA-funded school expansion projects like the one that destroyed a forest core habitat in Wakefield. And these are adding to the rapid declines in habitats and biodiversity. We are very concerned that when we grow up, we will be facing a climate and biodiversity crisis far worse than it is right now. I want to be able to walk in nature and listen to the songs of crickets, the trills of toads, and the calls of the wood thrush. I want to be able to see rock outcrops, the homes of tiger beetles. Each one of us needs to protect every single habitat, every single forest, no matter how big or small, to help biodiversity thrive. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Michael Mori.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I would like to thank everyone who's still toughing it out tonight. And I would especially like to thank Governor Healy for turning her attention to our forests. My name is Mike Mori, and I've been a consulting forester in Massachusetts for more than 25 years. In my work, I've spent countless hours and days in all seasons hiking and bushwhacking through the forests of Western Massachusetts, always curious and amazed at what I keep seeing and always pondering how to translate ideas about what to do or what not to do into good and practical recommendations for my clients. In fact, just today I was out in the forest, as on so many other days recently, and what I saw is both encouraging and discouraging at the same time. Here's what I saw. On the one hand, I was admiring the tall, layered, mature, and complex forest of mixed native species, so that was good. But on the other hand, many of the trees in this forest were not healthy. The hemlocks I saw were in very poor health, with thin crowns due to years of hemlock woolly adelgid infestation. Some hemlocks had died and others were obviously on death's doorstep. The fact that some of the hemlocks were well over 100 years old was not helping them fare any better than the younger ones. The leaves of the mid-story beech trees had been crinkled and distorted by the newly arrived beech leaf disease, and their fate is now very uncertain. The pine cones lying about on the forest floor were covered with white pitch that shows their stress response to a fungal pathogen that is attacking them. Some of the largest and oldest oak trees had large crowns of sickly-looking leaves following yet another caterpillar defoliation earlier this summer. Did I forget any? Oh, yes. Many of the white ash had already died, a result of the emerald ash borer. And then there was the oriental bittersweet, a non-native invasive vine growing into the new spot of sun on the forest floor under a recently killed oak tree, ready to overwhelm the young trees growing nearby. And furthermore, other young trees that were set to start growing had been chewed back by deer, which in their high numbers often overwhelm these early flushes of new growth. To see mature trees dying on the one hand and to see young trees failing to get started on the other hand was quite discouraging. I'm going to run out of time, and so I will have to submit the rest in the written comments. I thank you very much for staying on so late this evening.
Thank you. Next, we have Colin Novick.
Thank you very much. To start with, I'd like to preface this by the fact that European immigrants did not walk into a forest wilderness. Indigenous populations were managing Massachusetts forest, and a hands-off approach may accidentally neglect this historical reality of our forests. The state should work to encourage through incentives the principle of encouraging landowners to delay timber cutting to reduce carbon release by producing older and larger forest products that focus on sequestration and not young carbon release products like chip and pulp. Let's place a strong emphasis on developing forest reserves made up of a mix of municipal, nonprofit, and private lands bundled together, and that the state promote management of these with incentives, encouraging an emphasis on both wildlife and carbon sequestration as a dual framework. Reserves would also require management in order to realize these two goals. Reserves do not necessarily mean complete hands-off. With the understanding that a full freeze on all forest cutting would mean that most of our forest products would come from other countries that would have less regulations and usually would negatively impact poorer areas, we should acknowledge a need for creating a sustainable local economy with local products of local timber and local biofuel. Lastly, ecosystem management for species and habitat health requires forest management, and whatever framework is created needs to accommodate this particular use. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker is Miriam Kurland. Miriam, you're muted. Are you there?
There we go. Okay. Sorry about that.
Sure.
Okay. I just wanted to say thank you so much for extending the time so that I could speak. I had sent in written testimony, but didn't think I was going to be, I wasn't sure. I had to babysit for my grandkids and didn't know for sure if I'd be able to speak orally, but I'll do this. I'll try to do this quick. I feel very lucky to live in the beautiful rural western part of the state, right across the street from one of the amazing public forests. I care deeply and thoroughly enjoy all of our natural lands. I and citizens in my town consider the beauty around us as sacred and suffer at the thought of these lands being harmed by logging and being sprayed with pesticides and herbicides and exploited for their resources. The public forests are for the people of the state, and the people deserve to direct our state agencies to preserve our state-owned lands. I believe forests are critical for climate and biodiversity, including our life needs for clean water, clean air, and more stable weather patterns. We need our governmental agencies and leaders to preserve our public lands as wild. We are in a climate and biodiversity emergency, as you know, and we need nature to have the right to once again lead us. Humans are only part of the natural world, and we need to change our attitude of superior status and knowing it all and being all know-it-alls to manage nature. Nature has managed to survive much longer than humans have. Indigenous cultures only use natural organisms as they needed. They took one tree at a time and did it very respectfully. They didn't use these large machines that came in and bulldozed whole forests down and destroying the soils. It's time to allow nature to have rights, at least as many rights as corporate interests enjoy. The state has control over our public lands, and we need to prioritize our public lands as wild and give incentives for private landowners. There seems to be little real opportunity for forest protection advocates and the general public to have a meaningful voice in decision-making processes in the state. Even though the public clearly wants more drastic measures of conservation, our lands for forever wild, the state appears to be influenced much more strongly by vested interests to continue logging for wood products. We need wood products, but we need to cut down on how much new wood we need to cut down for. We can reuse wood. Why don't we recycle wood? We could substitute faster growing plants in that way. But public opinion has so little weight with state agencies or officials. And we're hoping that the Healy administration will put an end to that. And I thank you for this meeting and this chance to speak. And we hope that the public will be able to participate and be considered in all further meetings that the panels and decision makers make, so that we can voice our opinion and have input.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker, and thank you for your patience, is David King.
Hi, thanks for having this listening session. I appreciate the opportunity to submit my opinion about what forest reserves should be for and all this stuff, but I hope you don't really pay too much attention to my opinion, because I'm not really a trained forester. I hope that you pay attention to what people trained in forestry and experienced in forestry had to say, because I think that expertise is critical. I'll give you an example. My family has a place up in Maine, grew up there, and we had these dense hemlocks that we loved. The groves kept growing, and we grew up really caring a lot about those groves. Adelgid shows up because we're not having severe winters enough to kill the adelgid. So the canopy starts thinning out, and we get a forester down there to look at it finally, and they are just horrified. First of all, two things. First of all, they go across the entire property and they say, that's okay, that could use some work, this stand over there, and then they say that hemlock, that needs to be dealt with now. So the first lesson I took from that is the way that you decide what to do with these properties is to get a professional to evaluate them. That's the first step. And so they end up logging the site, right, to get the hemlock out of there, because otherwise we're going to have a 25-foot pile of just giant tree trunks. And we've got no young trees growing up. I mean, those older trees were just so dense and suppressing the growth underneath that now we've got nothing except ferns, and we're planting some stuff. But anyway, if we had intervened in that, like if we had talked to a forester 15, 20 years ago and had them in there and done the work, then they would have recommended some forestry that would have opened up the canopy, got some young trees in there to take over when the canopy trees die, get some other species in there. Because right now, with just a single age, single species stand, something comes through and kills those canopy trees. That's a big deal. And so the guy tells me that that is a common occurrence. And looking around, you know, I'm driving around, I see stands that look like that look like the hemlock stands that we had. Dense canopy, you know, just all these even age trees, all of them sort of not looking too good and nothing growing on the ground. Anyway, so I guess the take home from that is that when people tell you that logging like makes forests more resilient to climate change and pests, this is what they're talking about. And like I say, it looks like a lot of our forests are in that condition. And so we talked to a professional. I had one perception about this being, you know, a quasi sacred place, which I suppose it still is in its natural condition. I was wrong. Trained forester, you know, really basically helped us out in that situation. I mean, you wouldn't let someone work on your teeth unless they had a diploma, right? So why should forests be any different?
Thank you. I'm told we have one more speaker, and that is Peter Rayton.
It looks like Peter since left.
Okay. All right, then we've gotten through the entire list. So back to you on Undersecretary.
No, thank you. So I'll just, I'll just wrap up again. First with incredible gratitude for people taking the time to be with us tonight and bringing such, carefully thought out suggestions, ideas, and perspectives, and all presented in a respectful manner. So really appreciate that. We have here up the slide, on sort of the next steps, how you can stay in touch through our website, where to submit comments. We will be in touch and have more information about another public meeting later this fall with draft guidelines, another opportunity to comment. Please be assured that we will be sharing the comments with the Climate Forestry Committee of Experts we spoke about earlier. We will provide them with sort of a summary of themes that Susan will develop, and then they will also have access to the comments themselves in the recording. So with that, I wish everyone a good rest of your evening, and thank you very much for your time, and take care.
Good night.